I add something more. Your conference is part of the activities of an observatory committed to study regarding the innovation in the public sector. And this observatory brings together a great number of colleagues, Carla Gulotta, Marta Sosa, and me, and our research, and it is a pleasure to include your conference in the events carried out by these observatories. My colleagues, Carla Gulotta and Marta Sosa, are strongly committed to this line of research of neurotechnologies. They started with the conference in November, and your works today continue in the same direction, exploring aspects that are of great interest, but also raise main questions. Your choice to address these questions with several perspectives, not only the legal one, is particularly valuable since these phenomena have many and different implications. On November, the focus was on the human rights. Today, the debate revolves around consumer rights. And the relationship between neurotechnologies and consumption is very disturbing. We can say, and worrying, but I hope you can give a more reassuring reading. And therefore, I thank the colleagues, Carla and Marta, and all of you who participate, and please start your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Camilla, for your kind words. And welcome everyone to this international seminar on consumer rights and neurotechnology. As Camilla has rightly pointed out, this seminar aims to continue the work we started last November with the international workshop on human rights and neurotechnologies. And back then, Salvador, Carla, and myself managed to organize what I think was really an interesting exchange of ideas on the risks and the challenges that neurotechnologies actually pose for human rights. And because we managed to engage a group of neuroscientists, engineers on one side, and philosophers, bioethicists, and legal scholars to debate on such a huge matter. As today's seminar, which hopefully will be the first of a series of seminars, because this is the idea behind this new research line we are trying to foster, aims to follow up on this first meeting, but concentrating on the specific risks applicable to the use of non-medical and non-invasive neurotechnologies available on the market. So neurotechnologies that are available to consumers nowadays. And so this will be done approaching the topic from multiple perspectives, from the perspective of international law, Carla will approach, from European law with Paola Mariani's intervention, and also from American law with a professor from the United States, Robert Hill. Thank you very much, and without further delay, I will give the floor to Salvador. First, I would like to thank him very much for being here today, coming all the way from New York to be present in this seminar today. And I will just briefly introduce to Salvador, to his background, to his research background, and his scientific profile. So Salvador Dura Bernal is an assistant professor in the Physiology and Pharmacology Department at the SUNY Downstate University in New York. And he's a research scientist at the Nathan Klein Institute for Psychiatric Research. Salvador teaches neuroscience to PhD students and organizes several international courses and workshops on this issue. And 2 years ago, he started his own lab, the Dura Bernal Lab, focusing on developing large-scale biophysically detailed stimulations of the brain circuits in order to understand the brain's neural code and develop new treatments for brain disease, including brain-machine interfaces. Salvador has received a numerous amount of prizes, including the award from HPC Wire, the 2019 Robert Forgott Scholar Award, and in 2021 he was elected as one of the directors of the Organization for Computational Neuroscience and selected as a Google Cloud Research Innovator. He's currently the principal investigator in 3 grants funded by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the New York State Spinal Cord Injury Board. So without further delay, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta, for the nice introduction. Put the slides up. So should I share with WebEx the slides also?
Yes, sir. You put Google. Could you confirm from home that you can see correctly? Yes? Okay, Matteo confirms. Thank you, Matteo.
Okay, so thanks again for the introduction and for the invitation to this seminar. And today I'm going to talk mostly about the science and technology behind what the conference is about. And I'm actually going to focus on mostly research and medical applications. Even though this is focused on consumer BCI, I think the most advances have been done in these areas, in research and clinical, and I think it's where it's actually going to. So what can be done today in medical environments and research environments will be able to be done in the future in using consumer products. So I think that's where most of the dangers lie ahead. And so that's why my focus will be there. I will also give a brief overview of how the signals in the brain are recorded and why it's so difficult to understand them, and the differences between invasive and non-invasive devices, and also highlight at the end some of the issues with these consumer products. So to start with, I just want to move it up. A video that I've been showing actually for, I think, 8 years now in many of my talks, because I always think it's very illustrative of what can be done with brain technologies. And this is a woman that has been paralyzed for several years, and then she received. I can move it up. Okay, so she got an implant in the brain, in the part of the brain that's called the motor cortex. That's where the signals for motor control are processed. And even though she cannot move anything from the neck downwards, she was able to, with this very little electrode, which just has around 100 sort of wires in the brain, she can do these kind of things. And straight down, and left and right and diagonally. I can close it and open it, and I can go forward and back.
That is just the most astounding thing I've ever seen. Can we shake hands?
Sure.
No, really?
Yeah.
Like, come right over here?
Yes, you come over there.
Okay.
Grasp your hand there. There we go.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And I can do a fist bump if you'd like.
That's amazing.
Okay, so that's, it's technology from 10 years ago almost, but it's already quite amazing to see the level of control, not very fine control, it's very slow, it's not very precise, but she can do stuff that she wants to do. And when she is asked about how she does it, she says basically she just has to think about moving an arm like she would normally do. It's nothing special that she has learned to control this device, but just she thinks about moving an arm. And just by training the signals that are recorded from her brain, you're able to decode this and move them in the right direction. So today I'm basically going to show some examples similar to this one of different technologies that are possible today and different achievements that have been made in this field, just to illustrate the potential of this field. As I was saying, I think a lot of people are not aware of the things that can be done nowadays, and that will be able to be increased exponentially within the next 5, 10, 20 years. And so this is just a sort of the beginning of it. But when you talk to people about this, it's very interesting that many people are really completely unaware of any of this stuff. So that's why I wanted to make an emphasis about it. So very briefly, the definition of neurotechnology, and this broadly encompasses any electronic devices or methods that can be used to read or modify the activity of the neurons in the brain or in the nervous system. So you can also record from the spinal cord, for example. So basically, yes, reading activity or modifying the activity of neurons. That's the basic idea behind it. And of course, we emphasize this because neurotechnology is a word that can be used for many different things. So we want to make clear that here we're talking about this. So one neurotechnology that's been probably around for the most time is this deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. And this is from 1991, I think it was the first studies that came about, and it's been used for over 20 years, essentially. And it's quite impressive. It's stimulating an area of the brain called the basal ganglia, which is involved in reward and some motor movement and so on, which is affected by Parkinson's disease. And basically, when you stimulate, the person stops trembling. And of course, this is very inhabilitating for people who have Parkinson's, and it has restored the life of many, many patients. So let me play this video.
Tremors in dyskinesia. The twisting in my neck is called dystonia and is really quite uncomfortable. So as you can see, the tremors are getting much worse and I'm in quite a bit of discomfort, and I'm about to drop the remote control, which will be fun because I won't be able to turn myself back on. So I think party time is over. Almost automatically. The power comes back on. I'm steady.
So I think it's pretty stunning, the difference, and he obviously has the implant in the brain, and he clicks the button and then it turns on. By stimulating some neurons, the tremors completely stop. He can live a normal life. And this again is technology 20 years old.
Tremors.
So another example which has also been around for quite a while are the cochlear implants, and those are probably also very well known in society. And these are really brain implants because you are stimulating the cochlear nerve, the auditory nerve. And so what happens is you have a small microphone outside, and then the signals that the microphone records are translated into the appropriate signals that you need in the cochlea to hear whatever sound is outside. And this is just an example that I really like, which is a girl who for the first time hears her own voice and hears sounds outside after receiving the implant.
Okay, now they're both on.
They're both on.
Are they too loud? Are they too loud?
Can you hear me talking?
Can you hear us? Can you hear Mom?
Yeah.
You can hear me clearly?
Yeah.
You can hear what I'm saying?
Oh my gosh, this is so funny. I can hear my voice.
You couldn't hear your voice before?
No.
You couldn't?
No.
Okay, so again, this just illustrates how much of a difference these kind of things can make to people's lives. And of course, we're focusing on the dangers and things that we have to take care about, but also we should remind ourselves that this has really huge positive impacts in society.
Okay, now they're both on.
So another related, so we're talking about auditory system, but also in the visual system, there's a lot of advances nowadays. And this is, of course, more complicated than the auditory system. It has a much larger part of the brain dedicated to it. But I want to show two examples. And the first is this one, which was done in a laboratory in Spain. And they basically have these glasses, which again record the scene that the person is seeing, the visual scene. And then they send signals to an electrode that's implanted in the visual cortex, the part of the brain that processes the vision, basically. This electrode is not complicated. It's very similar to the one we saw at the beginning for the motor cortex. So just like 100 of these small electrodes. So essentially you're recording from around 100 neurons as well and stimulating around 100 neurons maximum. So it's very small, taking into account the brain has like 86 billion neurons. This obviously targeting a very small part. But even with that, you can also already see like this person was invident, so blind for 6 years or something like that. And when she received this implant, after some training during months, she was then able to recognize very basic shapes. So like squares, triangles, she was able to point to where the lines intersected. And so it's a very basic form of vision, but also the device that's being used is very basic. So it's just 100 electrodes. So you can imagine the potential that you can do with a much more elaborate design, technologies, and so on as they develop. And an example of these more developed technologies is work that's actually being done at my hospital by one Spanish researcher, and so there's Stephen Macknick and Susana Martinez Conde, and they've sort of started this large project to develop a very high precision visual prosthesis. So the idea here is using very high-tech technology known as optogenetics and recording from different parts of the brain to provide vision that is with high precision, and they sell it as the patient will be able to see or differentiate a single star in the sky. So if you look at the sky at night, the stars, of course, are very small, almost like a pixel in a screen. And so the idea is that with this device, the patient, like people who are blind, will be able to see this high level of resolution. And let me just show a small clip here of what the technology looks like.
Object, the light from its surface travels to the retina, where it is transformed into neural signals. These signals travel through the parts of the brain dedicated to vision. In the primary visual cortex, the brain represents the image in a map that matches the visual world. Our project proposes one potential idea to take advantage of this mapping so as to create a new prosthetic that will allow blind people to see. But the visual pathway will be different for a person who is blind. Here, the patient will wear a pair of eye-tracking glasses that monitors what is happening in the visual scene. These glasses will also track exactly where the eyes are pointed so that we know which information to transmit into the central retinal part of the brain. To get the information from the camera into the brain, we will first use gene therapy to turn specific neurons in the visual pathway into photoreceptors that take the place of the damaged retinas in the eyes of a blind person. Now we can stimulate those neurons with light. And our preliminary data shows that stimulation of these newly created photoreceptors.
It was just to give a brief overview, but this technology that they're talking about is called optogenetics. It's been a revolution in neuroscience for the last 5-10 years, and it basically allows you to target neurons in a very specific way. You put like a virus in the neurons you want to target, and then when you shine light to those neurons, they start firing, they get activated. So it's very precise, and it has a lot of applications. And yeah, so restoring vision in such a way that you have really a lot of precision would be, of course, life-changing for many people who are blind nowadays. Okay, so to the next example.
Vision is.
And here we're now moving to speech. So people who have some kind of paralysis that doesn't allow them to speak. And so I'm going to show 2 quick examples. Let me just play the video. I'm going through sort of the different sensory modalities just to show the breadth of these technologies and how they can be used.
UCSF researchers have shown that full words and sentences can be decoded from the brain activity of a person with paralysis who is unable to speak. Dr. Edward Chang's team worked with a brainstem stroke survivor who lost the ability to articulate words 15 years ago. The man has relied on other, limited means to communicate. In this study, an electrode device was implanted over the brain area that normally controls the vocal tract. A question was displayed for the participant, and the device recorded brain activity while he attempted to speak in reply. A computer algorithm translated the brain activity patterns into words and sentences in real time.
Okay, so just to illustrate this again, and so this, of course, is recording again from the part of the brain where the speech is generated, and so those signals are really then decoded and translated into these words. has a limited vocabulary, so that you cannot speak about anything. And the speed, as you saw, is not super fast yet, but again, it's just a beginning. And they actually compared with the speed of texting of people in the similar age band, like 60 to 70, and it was apparently quite similar. So, of course, for someone who's paralyzed, this is, again, quite life-changing. And another similar example to this is shown here.
Scientists at the Woodside Neurosciences Institute at Stanford University have created an improved method to let people with paralysis communicate freely and rapidly by translating brain activity to text. As part of an ongoing clinical trial, they implanted recording electrodes into the motor cortex of a man.
I probably ended too soon, but that's the same idea. And this one is interesting because what they're actually decoding is they ask the person to imagine handwriting the message. So hello, and what movements they would do with the hand to write that message. And what they're decoding is actually the thought movements of the hand for handwriting. They translate that then into words. So what we're seeing basically is that all the sensory inputs and outputs are really encoded in different parts of the brain. So in the visual cortex, in the auditory cortex, and the movement. And that these are just signals like in a computer or in other devices that you can read and decode and understand. And so I want to move now. Let me finish also with this interesting example, which is what we call closed loop. So here, the patient is not only, there's not only a device that reads the information, but also that writes back information. And in this example, it's used for sensory motor control. So when you're actually grasping objects, it's very important to have feedback of the object that you're handling, because it's been shown that if you don't really feel the object, it's very difficult to manipulate. You don't know how much force to apply. You don't know how to move around. And so actually feeling the object itself, it's really useful for people who are paralyzed. And so what they did here is not only read the desires of movement of the person, but also write back the touch sensation. This is the person we invited to our last conference, Nathan Copeland. So he got the first bidirectional implant where signals are decoded and also written back into the brain so the person can touch and feel the touch. And I have, I think, here a quick example.
Worked great. I couldn't see, but
to illustrate this feeling of touch. So the person is paralyzed again. He doesn't feel anything from neck downwards, but he's connected. The fingers of this robotic arm are basically sending signals to his somatosensory cortex, so he can feel as if this robotic hand was his.
Felt like I was getting my fingers touched or pushed, and they tell me I did it right. So index and middle. Did you just do more than one, or am I going crazy? Pinky. Middle. Pinky.
There we go. 20 out of 20. And so,
Just a quick example to show the person was feeling really as if that robotic arm was his. And in the talk he gave for us in November, he really explained the details of how he feels the touch sensation in different parts of the hand. And it's really, I don't know, for me, really exciting to hear the explanation, like tingling sensations, and really interesting. And here's just an example of using technology to... Here we go.
Nathan Copeland has a spinal cord injury as the result of a car accident in 2004. While he can't use his own arms to do this, he can use this robot arm just by thinking about moving it. Not only can he control the movements, but he can feel what's in its grasp.
Sometimes it's pretty natural, sometimes it's...
So yeah, that was to show that the actual grasping of the objects, it was made much easier by the fact that he could actually feel the touch of the object he was grasping. Okay, so now I want to kind of switch to... oh, this is him eating a burrito, but I'm going to skip it. To sort of another level. So up to now, I've been showing mostly... Yes, into the screen. sensory modalities, so vision, audition, touch, movement, and so on, which in general are easier to understand in the brain. They're more direct. We have like a very direct way to measure the effects of it and what is coming into the sensory signals. For me, the most shocking examples of these new technologies are those that treat more emotion, cognition, things that are really things that we believe are our inner self or are more personal level that we cannot really modify in these ways, or are more hard to understand how these technologies can affect these things. And it's been shown that they really work in a very similar way to these sensory modalities. No? It's at the end of the day, it's just activity in the brain, and you can read it and manipulate it. So I want to show two examples, and this first one is for treating depression. So of course, related to emotions in the brain. And it's using a similar technique to what we saw at the beginning for Parkinson's, this deep brain stimulation, where they put an electrode to deep parts of the brain. In this case, well, let me introduce the sort of patient and setup. So this person had been depressed since she was like 15 years old. She was now 39, and she had suicidal thoughts. So she says here, I couldn't stop crying. The thought that consumed me was just driving my car into marshland so I could drown. So she had these suicidal thoughts for many years now. She had tried many different treatments. So this is what we call a treatment-resistant depression. She had tried lots of medications, therapy, other types of stimulation that are non-invasive, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, and nothing had worked. So this new method, what they tried to do is using this deep brain stimulation, but in a closed loop, and that was the novelty. So in this, similar to the example before, where you were reading signals and then writing, we're doing this here, but for trying to treat depression. And so the idea is, well, before I play the video, is that they record from a part of the brain that they learned that could predict the bad moods of the person. So when the person was feeling bad or sad, and they then wrote or stimulated the brain to parts of the brain that they discovered could make the person feel better. So basically, when you feel bad, stimulate here so you feel better in a closed loop. And I'll just play the video which explains this. So they says the researchers located the site where stimulation elicited the best mood response. So they know where to stimulate to make a person feel better. They were basically trying many different places. And also another place where they record and they know when the person is feeling bad. And so basically they implanted this device where, so they record when the person is feeling in a bad depressive mood, they stimulate in this other region. They're very short stimulations, like 5 seconds, and very low amplitude. And what happens is that the person immediately felt a relief. So she describes that, like, I start getting negative feelings, but then they sort of disappear magically. And so they didn't really know if it was going to have long-lasting effects, which is another main concern of these things. But it seems that after over a year now, the person has described as recovering her life basically to normality. So I think there's a quote here. She says, within a few weeks, the suicidal thoughts just disappeared. And she's now, like, you know, living a normal life. She's been taking like gardening and normal activities that before she wasn't able to do at all. And again, so for me, this was a very shocking example. I just learned about this. Well, it's very recent. It's from 1 or 2 years ago. But the fact that emotions themselves can be sort of read in such a clear way and manipulated also so directly, I think it's very revealing about the potential of these technologies. And finally, for my last example, this is for patients with Alzheimer's. And again, similar technique, deep brain stimulation. And they've shown that stimulating in this part of the brain that is associated with memory, the hippocampus and the connections of the hippocampus with other parts of the brain, they basically demonstrated this part of the brain actually grew. So more neurons were generated, which is generally associated with increasing memory or at least maintenance of the memory in Alzheimer's patients. And a separate study also showed improvement in memory performance up to 20%. And so they do all these tests, batteries of tests for memory recall and so on. And they show by using this technique, you can perform 20% better. And they showed the example that people who have this traumatic brain injury, where they lose part of their memory function, they usually lose between 20 and 60% of the memory function. So recovering 20% is actually sort of a big deal. Like you can recover almost half of your lost function already. And this is, of course, very preliminary results. But what actually shocked me more about this study is that during these stimulation techniques, when they're trying all these experiments and so on, the person is awake because they're reporting what they experience and what they see. And so when they were stimulating this part of the brain called the hippocampus, the person sort of experienced memory flashbacks. So you stimulate a neuron and the person gets a memory and experiences a memory from the past, which is sort of, again, quite shocking in the sense that, you know, memories, which we think of as very personal and so on, at the end of the day are also just electrical signals in a way that you can stimulate and just recall a specific memory. And there's like a very long list of the different types of memories that people recalled, but they're super specific. And there's a couple examples. They said a childhood summer house from 10 years ago. And you can, of course, validate that these are real memories from the past. One recalled eating a sardine sandwich 23 years ago. So somewhere in the brain that was stored in a way that you can activate it and recall it again. And an interesting example that I really like is this person who recalled some kind of a person in a garden with a lantern or something like that, looking around, but he didn't see it very clearly. And so they basically increased the amplitude of the stimulation, so in the same place. And the person then sort of recalled more details about the scene. So it's like if you stimulate stronger, then you see more of the details of that actual memory in your brain. And then he remembered there was like a small kid also in the garden. And then they increased again the stimulation. And then he recalled that it was Halloween, and apparently that kid had been lost and they were looking for the kid. So not only can you recall specific memories, but you can change the intensity or the detail of the memory that you are recalling, which again, I think is very indicative of, you know, how things are stored in the brain. Okay, so up to here is the end of my examples that I find interesting. And I just want to give a brief overview of how this applies to consumer technologies. I want to start by talking about why the brain is so complicated. And I use this visualization. So this is the human brain, and this is a slice of the brain. And you can see here already the dark dots are what's called the gray matter, and those are the neurons or the bodies of the neurons. And you can see they're mostly around in the external part. This is the cortex, the outside layer of the brain. Also here in the center, we have lots of different regions. And then the white part is the white matter, and those are the axons, sort of the way that neurons communicate with one another, or the highways of the brain, they call them sometimes. So gray part are neurons, white part are the connections, the axons between the brain. The human brain has around 86 billion neurons, and each neuron communicates on average, they say, between 5,000 and 10,000 other neurons. So imagine the scale of that. If you multiply 86 billion times 10,000, you get like 1 trillion. And so that's the number of synaptic connections between the brain. So that's just the simple scale of numbers gives you an idea of the complexity of how to understand this. Of course, this brain is divided into many different regions, as we were saying. You see the visual cortex is in the back, the motor part, the hippocampus for memory is in the middle. But what makes it, I think, more complicated is that when you zoom in into one of these regions, so for example, if you zoom in into the visual cortex, the structure of these neurons in this part of the brain is also super complicated. So you have like 6 different layers. There are different types of neurons in each layer. They connect in very specific patterns. You see here an example. And each of the regions is slightly different. So there's like a very local complexity. The circuits of the brain in each part are also very complex and very structured, and everything has a meaning. These layer 2-3 neurons connect to layer 5 for a reason, and so you start looking into a lot of complicated detail. And even worse, when you zoom in into a single neuron, the machinery, sort of the biological molecular complexity of one single neuron is equally complicated. So you have, I think there's a zoom now, yeah. So you have all these, for example, synapses, the way that 2 neurons communicate with one another. You have lots of different molecules that are sent from one another. You have modulation from other parts of the brain that affect how these synapses function. You have ionic channels that open and close to generate the signals. So it's a super complicated molecular machinery in each of the neurons. So when you put all this together, it means that you have lots of different scales in the brain, each one interacting with each other, because the networks of neurons affect the single neuron affect the other one, and the whole brain, different areas of the brain are connected to each other in very long range connections. So the visual cortex is connected to the amygdala, to the hippocampus. So it's complicated, basically. And it's complicated because there are many scales and they all interact with each other. And this, I point this out because when we talk about all these technologies of reading and writing, we must not forget that we are in very early stages, and we're doing very basic things with just a few hundred neurons, and we don't really yet understand how the brain neural code works fully. There's also another big issue with plasticity. So all these connections are changing over time, in, again, complicated ways that we don't fully understand. And so we should be cautious in all these technologies, because in general, we don't really know what are the effects of what we're doing. We see some immediate effects that are beneficiary, but particularly when we move into the non-invasive techniques, and this is what this slide is about, things can get more tricky. So all the examples that I've shown today are invasive in the sense that you put things inside the brain. You require surgery to open the brain up and put an electrode inside or multiple electrodes. But many of these consumer technologies that we're talking about are non-invasive, which means they do stuff from outside of the brain. And you can see here, these electrodes, the EEG electrodes, are placed on the scalp of the brain, and they're basically recording signals from outside. So whereas when you have these LFP, electrodes that you put inside the brain, you can record from individual neurons potentially. When you put it outside the brain, you are really recording from hundreds of thousands of neurons at the same time. And as I was explaining before, these circuits of neurons are very detailed, very specific, and each set of groups of neurons do a very specific thing. So when you record from 1 million neurons altogether, it's sometimes very hard to really understand what it means. And so that's why we have to be cautious about these non-invasive consumer technologies, particularly for the stimulation part, because, okay, you can record from 1 million neurons and not understand what is happening, but when you stimulate 1 million neurons or 100,000 neurons, then really the consequences of that can be really undesired, and we don't really know what's happening there. Here's a diagram. So these invasive techniques, they go to the level of the single neuron or groups of neurons, but when you record from EEG, for example, you really are recording from hundreds of thousands of neurons. So again, these consumer technologies that are used nowadays, and for example, EEG can be used to do a lot of similar things like control wheelchairs or type or so on. This transcranial magnetic stimulation is used for depression, and it's been quite successful in many cases. But when you move this to the consumer market, where people can buy their own devices and try them at home, then again, you have the risk of not really understanding what you're doing, misusing it, putting where it doesn't go, or abusing it, doing more stimulation than you need. And of course, this can have undesired effects, permanent damage to the brain. So we should really study all this and put some regulations potentially to limit all these dangers. And of course, our risk is that these companies that want to sell these products, they're going to oversell them, oversell the benefits without any research backing them, exaggerate them for marketing purposes. So we should also take that into account. And as we have seen in the previous conference, there are many risks. And we have seen today that we are able to manipulate memory, intentions potentially, our sensations, our mood. So of course, this means that we can really change a person to the core of the person. And we have seen, this can change the personal identity of a person, the free will, make them do things that they don't want to do, read their more inner thoughts, desires. And so we should take into account all these potential risks to human rights. And just to finish, I will emphasize that, of course, technologies and these very disrupting technologies and revolutionary technologies like artificial intelligence, the internet, and so on, and this, I think, is a similar one. They're not really good or bad per se. It depends on how we use them, and so we should make an effort to understand them, and I think that's one of the aims of this type of workshop that we're doing, communicate to the general people what it's about, so that people can then try to harness these potential technologies for the good and not for the bad. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Salvador. This was a really insightful presentation, and it has been really important to start in this way our seminar, because now we know what are we talking about. I'm Carla Gulotta. I'm assistant professor here at Università Milano Bicocca of International Law, and I'm happy to be part of the organizing committee of this seminar, as well as the first one that Marta, Salvador, and I organized in last November. So I will start immediately with the second presentation, which is my presentation on international trade perspective, requires a preliminary clarification of the scope of the inquiry. So speaking of products today, I am referring not only to hardware, so not only to physical goods, but also to systems comprising software, digital platforms, and apps to provide services based on neurotechnologies. I will not dwell on neurotechnologies because Salvador Tura-Bernal has already made us understand what kind of technologies we are speaking about. I will have to dwell on the perspective of the international trading system, which is always seen as a system that keeps countries, keeps state linked and obliged to promote liberalization of trade flows. Well, actually, the international trading system is not really about free trade, but it is a system about how to regulate trade. So this means that it leaves countries a policy space, and this policy space is where regulators can operate, also when dealing with this kind of new technologies. There are, in fact, a whole host of tools that members of the World Trade Organization can turn to in order to address the needs of their citizens, of their businesses, and of society at large. And the research question we are dealing today is if some of these tools could be instrumental to tackle the issues opened by the arrival of these technologies on the market. So given the short time of this intervention, I'm just going to summarize a few thoughts that will later develop in writing. First, what scope trade liberalization commitments leave for WTO members in order to face the challenges of neurotechnological products. And as a second point, I will attempt to make clear if the normative institutional framework of the World Trade Organization system can be instrumental to manage the risks which are linked to neurotechnological products. So, starting from the first point, adopting an international trading system mindset, we could rationalize the challenges of neurotechnological products through a risk-based taxonomy, and we could identify three different risk categories: health risks, public moral, public order hazards, so possible hacking of brain data, possible abuse of technologies, hazards linked to the use of technologies for aims of human enhancement, national security hazards. Starting with WTO tools for tackling health risks, studies on the home use of neurowearable devices with transcranial direct current stimulations have reported the occurrence of adverse effects, such as, for example, headaches, skin rashes, or bruises. These collateral effects have been mainly reported as mild, but the only recent introduction of these devices on the market outside of a medical context could call for an attitude of caution, as effects of a prolonged use on health, brain development, personality are still unknown. Under the rules of the multilateral trading system, the free flow of goods can be legitimately denied due to health reasons. In fact, one of the cornerstones of the multilateral trading system is the principle recognizing the freedom of each member of the WTO to choose the level of protection of health within its boundaries. Although not affirmed with the same strength in all the different WTO agreements, this principle is horizontally effective, so that we can affirm that the distribution on the market of direct-to-consumers neurotechnological goods could well be prohibited on the grounds of health concerns. What is more, we can also argue, dwelling both on normative and systematic grounds, that the precautionary principle has citizenship within WTO law, so that a cautious approach would be covered. The decision to keep neurowearables out of the domestic market would have, however, to comply with the general WTO rules, and first of all, of the rules of non-discrimination based on their country of origin. To give an example, this means that the European Union could not favor European over American products. According to WTO law, claims of discrimination in favor of domestic products could even be brought, striking a comparison between products apparently quite different from one another. Wearables for concentration enhancement and drugs with a similar prescription. In such a case, health risks associated with the product may be deemed relevant to the determination of likeness to the extent that they have an impact, if they have an impact on the competitive relationship between the products. For example, the fact that consumers tend to prefer and buy drugs instead of neurostimulation devices because of health concerns could exclude that the same drugs and devices be considered like products. And the consequence is that different terms of trade could be legally applied to them. Looking at how neurotech markets are actually shaping, that is, considering that while the US has the lead in the neurodevices market, EU startups are emerging, especially in the market of software, digital platforms, and apps, we could make the hypothesis of an action brought by the US against the European Union, in which the former pledges a discrimination under GATT Article 3.4 on the grounds that direct-to-consumers neurodevices against depression and technology platforms and apps for the same health prescription are in a competitive position on the market, so that a European measure banning the former and allowing the latter would amount to discrimination. However, the right of WTO members to decide the level of health protection within their boundaries can go so far as to justify even violations of WTO rules. This means that restrictive measures hindering the international trade of neurowearables could be allowed if deemed necessary to protect human life or health, and that any particularly strict technical regulations of these products, for example, labeling requirements, would appear justified if they had been adopted to fulfill a legitimate objective, such as the protection of human health or safety, or the protection of animal or plant life or health. But health risks are only one, and apparently not the more serious of the risks arising from direct-to-consumer neurowearables. While devices for neurostimulation raise the greatest health concerns, even the mere acquisition of brain data from healthy individuals can raise quite delicate ethical issues. In the agreement regulating the international trade of goods, a specific exception justifies measures that restrict trade for moral reasons. And a mirroring article in agreement on the liberalization of trading services confers the same excusing effect to public morals and public order motives. Policy objectives like guaranteeing the respect of human dignity in the employment relationship, avoiding social inequalities in education may both be covered by the moral exception. Protecting citizens from the hacking and misuse of their brain data could be instead considered adequate to satisfy the public order exception in the GATS that may be invoked when a genuine and sufficiently serious threat is posed to one of the fundamental interests of society, thus allowing to ban services aimed at providing such contents to private companies and individuals. To sum up, the public moral exception may come to play a relevant role in the near future, consenting to frame the distribution of neurotechnological devices and services on the global markets in a way that reflects the different cultural identities of the members of the multilateral trading system. Allowing, for example, European countries to restrict market access to foreign devices not complying with their high standards of protection of personal data, to the US to veto apps and services for public control, social scoring acceptable in Oriental cultures and effectively implemented in China. Another venue offered by the WTO system to tackle health, moral, and public order concerns arising from neurotech products could be that of recurring to the flexibilities offered by the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. It is the so-called TRIPS agreement, like the exclusion from patentability or the compulsory licensing mechanism. The generalization of patent protection under the TRIPS agreement and its effects on public health have been broadly debated since the mid-1990s, when the TRIPS agreement was signed. This debate intertwines with our topic without covering it completely, as we know, in fact, direct-to-consumer neurotech products spread from the medical to the wellness, leisure, educational fields, and touch concerns that could be faced either with a ban or, on the contrary, with a policy of public funding to grant uneven access to neurotechnological products to the whole population. So drawing an active policy for neurotechnological products is by no means an easy task. I will just share with you the doubt that the exclusion from patentability might here be appropriate. Faced by such breakthrough technologies, which so vast a range of possible application, it is perhaps in the main interest of social community not to renounce the transparency of information ensuing from the duty of the patent applicant to unveil the project of his invention. Now, coming to WTO tools to tackle public security concerns. Products embedding non-invasive neurotechnologies could be considered as posing threats to national security. For example, if fallen in the disposal of criminal or terrorist organization or used by enemy countries in military defense context. To offset this kind of public hazards, WTO law allows members to resort to any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. Precisely to explore the opportunity to recur to this exception, in November 2018, the Department of Commerce Bureau of Industry and Security of the United States published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking seeking public comment on the inclusion of BCI technology in a list of emerging technologies essential to US national security, so that effective export control could be implemented. From a more general perspective, such actions would injure those people that could benefit from further advancement of neurotechnologies. In the medical context, we have seen with Salvador Dura Bernal how precious the use of the techniques is already nowadays. Besides, the almost complete deference due to the discretional decision of a state rightfully invoking the security exception makes it ineffective to address global security concerns. This last consideration, stigmatizing all unilateral solution, allows me to turn to the second part of the presentation. Sorry. Which deals with this question: can the normative institutional framework of WTO be instrumental to manage the risks linked to neurotechnological products? My starting point here is the robust multilateral character of the WTO, which is profoundly embedded in its institutional structure and in its aims. This, together with the strong support for values of international cooperation and sustainable development, could open interesting opportunities for addressing in a multilateral setting the issues related to the regulation of the market dimension of neurotechnologies. I will mention three fields where the multilateral trading system can play a role. First, WTO law offers a framework favoring the establishment of international standards. Standardization eases up international trade, but it is also a means to fine-tune quality and security characteristics of goods and services. Although it may seem too early to standardize BCIs, private standardization bodies are already working on this. The Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Standards Association, for example, is releasing 4 standards on human augmentation, the first one on taxonomy and definitions, one on privacy and security, the third on identity, and a final one on the methodologies and processes for ethical consideration. There is no need to highlight how desirable would be a cooperation among countries on these topics. For the EU-US, this can already start within the Trade and Technology Council, established in June 2021. Another positive contribution relates to the promotion of transfer of technology and of technological assistance, which could contrast the dystopian gap of an enhanced, developed, and a not enhanced developing world. Non-invasive neurotech devices could arouse invention developers' interest as products intended for the highly profitable markets of developed countries, and this could result in widening the gap between developed and developing countries. Third, and here I conclude, the WTO system offers an institutional framework allowing states to attain a high level of transparency and a global forum for striking a balance between the different and sometimes diverging public interests at stake in the regulation of international trade. The challenges of trading neurotechnological products could be discussed with profit within the TRIPS Council and in a framework of the trilateral cooperation on public health, trade and intellectual property, which started in 2009 between the World Health Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and the WTO. This initial confrontation on trade-related aspects of neurotechnologies should be just the first step of a more comprehensive regulation of these technologies by an international treaty, whose content should take advantage of the support of the scientific community already collaborating within the International Brain Initiative, and that would constitute the heart of a composite framework where ethical challenges will have to be adequately addressed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carla, for this insightful presentation and for giving us an idea of the potential that the World Trade Organization playing an active role in regulating these technologies can be. Thank you so much. And with this reference to the possibility of thinking about an international treaty to regulate these technologies, I am going to give the floor to our next speaker, that is Professor Robert Field, who will actually, connect this idea of international treaty, because he will talk about the similarities and differences in the risks and the regulation of genetic data, for which there is already an international treaty initiative, and brain data. He will also give us an American perspective of this regulation. I will briefly introduce Professor Robert Field, who is Professor of Law at the Klein School of Law and Professor of Health Management and Policy at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University. He is also a Senior Fellow of the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on genetic privacy, the structure of health systems, the ethical issues in vaccines. He has written several books and more than 50 scholarly articles, and he also received a PhD in psychology from Boston University and JD from Columbia Law School and an AB from Harvard College. Without further delay, given that we are already falling late, I am giving you the floor, Robert. If you stop, you can share your slides if you.
Okay, well, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Robert Field. I'm on the faculty at Drexel University in Philadelphia. I'm speaking to you now from Philadelphia. I am both at the law school and the public health school, and my work is at the intersection of law, policy, bioethics, and health-related technologies. I have been working recently on projects involving the privacy of genetic data, particularly in large databases. And this presentation will look at some of the risks related to those databases, compare them to the risks of databases that include neurotechnology data, explain the legal framework in the United States for both the gaps and then some suggestions for needed reforms to the law, and also to an ethical analysis that underlies the law. So as a way of brief overview, I will talk generally about the technologies, their risks, and the question of exceptionalism. Are they different from conventional medical information, and do they deserve special legal and ethical consideration? I will then talk about the regulatory responses, the protections, first, just very generally for the safety and quality of genetic tests and neurotechnology data gathering, and then the issues of privacy and discrimination. I will focus then on direct-to-consumer data, the companies that sell directly to people generally online without a physician or other intermediary, and then new directions for law and ethics. Okay, so let's begin with what is genetic data? Genes are made up of DNA, which you see on the left, There are 4 bases, CGAT, cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine, that link up in specific patterns, and it is those patterns that determine your DNA and your genome. If you look at the right, that's a part of a gene, and it's that sequence of letters that determines what the gene does and how it affects your physiology and your behavior. What does that look like? To me, that looks like computer code. 4 elements rather than just zeros and ones, but very similar in concept. What that means is, like computer code, it's easy to store and it's immutable. Your genome today is your genome for the rest of your life. And what do we do with that? Tremendous strides in research and understanding the correlation between that code and who you are, how you're built, what you can do. On the left is a single gene, that is the BRCA gene for breast cancer. Finding those single genes, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, other conditions, helps us to spot the problems, to plan prevention, and to target gene therapy to put in corrective genes. And then on the right, you see an array of genes which are used in what's called genome-wide association studies for more complex conditions like diabetes, schizophrenia, where we think that dozens of genes are involved, and we are beginning to gain at least the information on what the profiles are of those genetic traits, so that we can diagnose and hopefully prevent. So what are the risks? The opportunities are tremendous. What I've done here is to list some of the major ones. The 3 that I've bolded are distinct from the risks of neurotechnology data. So finding out embarrassing things about yourself, things that you'd rather not know, your susceptibility to various conditions, particularly psychiatric conditions, the social stigma that can attach, going down a couple, discrimination. An insurance company or an employer or a landlord might not want to deal with you, interact with you, if they knew you had a predisposition to different traits. As was mentioned in the first presentation, do-it-yourself diagnosis, the risk that people will get a genomic analysis and not discuss it with a physician or other professional, and cultural religious issues about, particularly among Native Americans, among lineage, about lineage and the mythology of where the people come from. State action, we see in China genomic data being used to distinguish Uyghurs and other minority groups. But distinct to genomic data are family secrets, parentage, finding out that people who you thought were your biological parents are not, and finding out that your lineage is different than you thought. There's the potential for racial profiling and eugenics for use by people who want to distinguish the races based on pseudoscience and traits that they think they found. And then I think most importantly, it can identify relatives. So your genes are shared with everyone you're related to, and it's becoming increasingly possible to identify them, even if they have no idea that you've contributed genes to the database. Re-identification of anonymous genomes is becoming increasingly possible. Generally, genetic data is stored anonymously. When you contribute to a genetic database, they say that they will not identify you without your permission. And yet researchers, this is a story from Nature magazine from 2016, are finding that with just a little bit of additional data, they can identify up to 90% of the people in a genetic database. More recently, this article from 2018 talks about using other databases, demographic databases, just public databases of names and addresses to identify people whose genomes are in databases, up to third cousins. I'm not even sure what a third cousin is, but that's someone who bears a minor genetic relation to you that you probably don't know and will probably never meet. The potential exists to identify soon any American of European descent. And that's because most of the databases are primarily European data. It will be, as we collect data on people from other continents, it will be increasingly easy to identify them as well. So this is a chart of who you're related to. Clearly, you're related to your parents, to siblings, to children. You share half the genes, a quarter with your grandparents. But if you look on the right-hand column, the third cousin you share less than 1% of your genome with. You probably have a lot of them, and they are people you've never met, yet if they have contributed to a database, it may be possible to identify you and discriminate against you. So bioethicists are engaged in a vigorous debate as to whether this makes genetic information exceptional. Is it different from conventional medical data? And I would say it is, and therefore it merits special legal and ethical treatment. Number one, it's immutable. Your cholesterol level, your blood sugar level, that's going to change with therapy, with diet. It may be different tomorrow than it is today. Your genes will be with you for your entire life. It is highly personal. Your genome isn't just saying what your risk of heart disease or diabetes is. It's saying potentially anything about you. It's increasingly identifiable because it's specific to each person. And unlike other medical information, it can identify your relatives. So let's take a look at brain data. We have direct-to-consumer products. On the left here is someone with electrodes implanted in a cap that is connected to a computer and through the internet to the service provider. And that information can produce an EEG, which you can see on the right. Not as easy to store as the genetic code and changeable, but still information that can be kept and that can be put in a database and that can expose the subject to all of the risks of genetic data and then a couple more. Again, some of them are similar: social stigma, embarrassment, privacy, not just identifying others, but what you think of them, discrimination, the action of state actors, but also unwanted personal revelations, thoughts and attitudes that you didn't know you had or you don't want to share with other people, and then the risk of manipulation. It was mentioned in the first presentation that it may be possible to control people's thoughts and actions in ways they don't want. This is an interesting example of the potential for brain data, for neurotechnology to intrude into your most personal thoughts. It was a game developed at the University of Washington. You can see a screenshot of the game on the upper right. You can download it from the Google Store or the Apple App Store. It produces the game that they developed, the University of Washington, online images and EEG signals. The game becomes increasingly difficult as you go along, so your concentration is more and more important. And what they did was to intersperse images, logos, for instance, of fast food restaurants, of cars, and to get your reaction. If a McDonald's arch popped up, do you react positively, negatively? What's your attitude towards different consumer products? And that can be used for directed marketing, marketing research, and other purposes. What they then tried, which is the scariest part, is sending subliminal messages, images for milliseconds, short enough that you would not be consciously aware of them. But by looking at your reactions, it's possible to delve your thoughts concerning them, whether it's financial information, religious beliefs, political leanings, medical conditions, even prejudices. So the potential for risks here, for distinctive exceptional risks, is certainly present. And again, for this reason, I think neurotechnology and brain data are exceptional. Intimate details, again, identifiable with you, identifiable with others. And unlike genetic information, it facilitates behavioral manipulation. So quick comparison, we see risks are largely similar. Genetics does not have the risk of behavioral manipulation or of physical harm, even without invasively planting electrodes. Altering your brain plasticity and how it changes with experience is a risk distinctive to neurotechnology. And then exceptionalism, both are exceptional, not in exactly the same ways, but they share key exceptional features. So what do we do about that? Quickly, in terms of safety and quality regulation, the Food and Drug Administration reviews tests and devices that have medical applications for which medical claims are made. They have no authority over tests and devices with non-medical applications, like ancestry tracing for genetics, trait testing, general wellness through EEG and feedback for neurotechnology data, promoting healthy lifestyles through either of these, biofeedback or whatever, wellness, human flourishing, and there's no requirement for expert interpretation. There is approval before a product reaches market with health claims, but the FDA has a long way to go in learning how these new technologies that change by the day need to be regulated. Deceptive advertising is regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. They do have jurisdiction over products that are not FDA approved, but they don't look at safety and quality. They would look at false advertising, false claims. They have had a privacy initiative since 1995, but as of now, little enforcement. So there clearly are gaps with regard to protecting the public from ineffective or dangerous products. So turning to privacy regulation, this is the business model for companies in both fields. Google makes its money off of the data. Facebook makes their money off of the data, and the direct-to-consumer genetics and neurotechnology companies make most of their money by acquiring data and then selling it to other parties who want to use it for various means. Briefly, there are 4 federal laws in the United States that apply. Hipaa, implemented through what's called the privacy rule, addresses the disclosure of medical information, but only medical information. Your consent is needed to reveal information about your health or your medical treatment or diagnosis, but it only applies to what's called covered entities, healthcare providers, insurers, data clearinghouses. There are multiple exceptions. The entity can share de-identified data for research, but that data can often be re-identified and can share it with business partners who then have more limited restrictions on what they do. The common rule is the rule for research shared by 15 federal agencies that requires the review and oversight of what's called an institutional review board, an IRB, for research that for protection of human subjects, but it only applies to research that's federally funded or is used for a clinical trial for the Food and Drug Administration for approval of a drug or device. The oversight of the IRBs varies considerably, and the privacy expertise of the members varies considerably. They're more focused on physical risks to patients than they are on privacy risks. So those are the main laws that keep data private. Once the data gets out, there are a couple of laws that restrict the use of it. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act prohibits using genetic information to discriminate in health insurance or employment, but it only applies to genetic traits and it does not apply to many forms of insurance, to education, to housing, to mortgage lenders, and the plaintiff must prove discrimination, which is often difficult to do. There is no similar law for brain data. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination in employment and public services based on a disability, but it is not clear, and there has been limited enforcement with genetic predispositions, which are generally not considered disabilities if they have not manifested yet. And it is not clear that non-clinical brain data would reflect a disability. So there are a few other laws, none of them very helpful. The Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, prevents discrimination based on pre-existing medical conditions, but only for health insurance. And the Civil Rights Act would apply if the discrimination clustered around racial groups, for instance, genetic information, but that is unusual and it is very difficult to prove. We'll be hearing from the next speaker about the GDPR, which does affect American companies that do business in the European Union. However, it does not protect you if your relative has uploaded data and there's a private right of action, but then the onus is on you as the data subject to act. There are laws in some states that mimic the GDPR, but they are variable between states and they only apply to residents of those states. So let me turn now to the DTC, direct-to-consumer industry. For genetic testing companies, it's grown tremendously. 90 companies, probably more by now, $1.5 billion in revenue and data on over 25 million customers, just American customers. And in the neurotechnology industry, at least 29 companies, that's about 2 years ago, and more than $3 billion in revenue. And here's the logo of just a few of them. So how are they regulated? Hipaa, the medical privacy law does not apply because they're not healthcare providers and it's not necessarily medical data. Review by an IRB is not required because their research is self-funded, not federally funded. There's a limited reach of the state laws. The primary protection you have is the terms of service, the privacy policies of those companies, which are often ambiguous and difficult to find. And there is no protection in those privacy policies for what a third party does if they get their hands on the data. So privacy policies are voluntary. Companies can have them or not have them. They're variable. They're changeable. Companies reserve the right to change them at any time. And there's little protection if the company is acquired or it merges or it goes bankrupt and someone else acquires the database as an asset. On the right is a screenshot of a product you can download with an instant privacy policy. So you just download it, you fill in the name of your company, and that's your privacy policy. It is not a very intricate legal document. So a survey of 90 privacy policies of genetics companies found tremendous variability and huge gaps. I'll mention a few of these findings. 39% of the companies had no privacy policy at all on their websites. All of them permit changes without notice. About half allow data to be kept indefinitely, and virtually all of them provide no information on data breaches, no information on who to contact for information, and 43% of the research studies done with their data provide no information on informed consent of subjects. What I'd like to do to summarize this is to go through the privacy policies of some key companies. 23andMe is the second largest genetic data company. They are the most consumer friendly. They provide a right of access, a right of correcting data, a right to have data deleted, a right to portable data to bring it to another vendor, but they also reserve the right to change their policy at any time. Ancestry.com has the largest number of customers, and a few features of their policy are that if you interact with social media, they can combine these with your genetic data. They work with third-party partners to analyze your data for advertising purposes, so they reserve the right to target ads to you based on your genetic and social media data. They remind customers they're not covered by the Hipaa law. They're not a medical provider, so none of those protections apply. And then they can share your personal information with a company that acquires them, and you don't know who that might be. A couple of neurotech companies, Emotive says that they can share data with their business partners. They have no responsibility if you release personal data to them for what happens, and they can change the policy at any time. OpenBCI says that, again, they can link your brain data with your social media accounts. They can transfer your information if there's a corporate change, like a sale of the company or bankruptcy or acquisition. And at the bottom, they can change the policy at any time. So to sum up on the legal front, I think technological exceptionalism, which we've seen for these technologies, presents the need for legal exceptionalism, for new kinds of ways of thinking about legal protection. There is a proposed law in Congress right now to protect online privacy, but it doesn't get at some of the key distinctive features of genetic and brain data. What we need is to regulate the terms of service so that every company has to abide by the same protections. Companies should be required to disclose key items like where the data is stored, and that you have the ability to withdraw or delete your data. And there should be limits on the transfer and sale of data. We need to prohibit and restrict brain manipulation. Right now, there's nothing legally that would prevent that. And there should be mandatory identification of relatives and others who are identified by use of the technologies. And then a final thought that to move forward legally, we need to move forward with the bioethical foundation. The notion of cognitive liberty is something we wouldn't have thought about before we had neurotechnology. Your right to your own thoughts and your own behavior. We need to define the rights of others who are identified through your data. And then we need to consider the very notion of agency and individual autonomy. What does it mean when your genes affect your behavior? What does it mean when your brain physiology affects your behavior? So the next frontier is fundamentally rethinking the ethics of behavior. And thank you very much.
I don't know if they were listening to us. No, but
Robert, I don't know if you...
non ha sentito niente.
No. Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Yeah, no, my curiosity is, given your expertise on the American system, what is your perspective and your personal feeling in the confrontation between this system and the European one? Our approach, which is so much more attentive on the protection of personal data.
Yes. Clearly, the European Union is more concerned about the consumer. There are new proposals to go beyond the GDPR for storage of online information to fight misinformation online. We have nothing like that in the United States. The United States is more concerned about personal liberty and corporate liberty and gives more weight to the idea that the consumer and the corporation are engaged in a free negotiation, which in fact is not the case because very few individuals really understand what they're getting into when they share something as personal as their genetic or their brain data. For me personally, I think the European Union has a more sensible attitude. Some of our states, as I mentioned, led by California, are trying to mimic that, but we do not have national legislation. And if it's state by state, it does not protect anyone who is not in one of those states.
I see, thanks.
Speakers.
So now I can introduce the next speaker, who is Paola Mariani. Paola will present a speech on the patient or consumer, and it will be an examination of the EU's regulatory framework from Regulation 2017/745 of the European Parliament and of the Council on Medical Devices to domestic initiatives. Paola is Associate Professor of International Law at Università Bocconi in Milano. She's in charge of international law and EU private international law courses. Her research covers an area in between international and European Union law and focuses on economic issues. Recently, in the last years, she has written about Brexit mainly, a lot actually, publishing a volume on leaving the European Union, legal reflections on withdrawal in the days of Brexit, quoted by the Attorney General in the first case on the interpretation of Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union, decided by the Court of Justice, and 2 chapters in the volumes of The Law and Politics of Brexit for the Oxford University Press, co-authored with Giorgio Sacerdoti. In addition, since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, she has been studying the export control measures adopted by the European Union, and she authored The EU Market in Times of a Global State of Emergency, Internal and External Trade Barriers in the Age of Pandemics, Legal Issues of Economic Integration. So, Paola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Carla, for having me today. And as Carla said, my speech is especially on the regulation by the European Union. And in particular, I will cover the regulation on medical devices. Starting on this issue, on this regulation framework, I consider the problem of the individual rights involved in regulating such technologies and neurotechnologies, and of course I entered in the world of the human rights involved in this area, and I know that you already covered this issue in the past seminar, in the first seminar, but I think that the point is more or less the same when we consider the market regulation on these devices, because the question is if it's necessary to have a specific regulation concerning this kind of devices, so devices that related to the brain and these technologies that can record or alter the brain activity. So to have a special market regulation, or to rely on the general regulation of medical devices and human rights and data protection, and to have this specific, so it's not necessary to have, so we have 2 different positions. One is maybe it's necessary to take into account the specificity of this sector. And the other one, no, we can rely on the general regulation of all the devices concerning the use in medical field. And I think that the EU approach is a general approach. So we don't have a specific regulation, and we rely on the way in which the European Union traditionally regulate the use of goods in the market, so the market regulation. And as the previous speaker said, Professor Field, in the EU there is more attention to the protection of the consumer. And this attention to the protection of the consumer is strictly connected to the protection of personal rights and in some way also human rights. And so this is why the way adopted by the EU legislator is to consider market regulation as a way to protect also personal right. But one of the specificity of this field is that now we are facing a very rapid improvements in neurotechnology. And so it's another question that we can raise considering the way to regulate is it still right to consider a general approach, a general rules approach to these issues, even in a situation that is changing rapidly in the evolution, in the improvements, and also in the change in the technology. So I identified three areas that are that raise a regulatory issue in this field. The first one is the most traditional, is how to deal with all the legal and ethical issues implied. So we have already seen problem of privacy, protection of mental and physical integrity, access to data, autonomy, bias, and unequal access to these technologies. And so in this way, I'm going to consider how the market regulation can deal with these issues. The second is the regulation of non-medical devices, because we have seen that one of the problems is not just that we have these devices that are used in a medical context or for medical purposes, but we know that the same technologies can be used outside. And so here again, there is the problem of market regulation, and in which way, and here maybe we can distinguish between patients and consumers. When we are in a medical environment of research, there is in the European tradition, it's more accepted that we have a high level of patient consumer protection. But when we are outside the medical field, of course, we can have a lower level of protection, even if we have seen that maybe this kind of devices can imply risks for the health and for the brain of the person who uses this device. And And finally, I try to cover very quickly one of the problems that is when you are in a market regulation, because when you have a market regulation, you have to balance two different interests. One is the interest of the industry. And of course, the interest of the industry is an economic interest. So the possibility to make research freely and to have a possibility to market the products quickly and not to eliminate the constraints, to have a free market. On the other side, you have also the general interest of the protection of the health and the protection of all the values that in the European Union system are protected. And so, this is something that in the European tradition is taken into account also in a more, let's say, trade environment. Just to give you an idea of what I mean for regulatory framework, we can say that the regulation, the main regulation in the European Union now is the medical device regulation that is entered into force in May 2021. This is not a completely new legislation, because we had, this is a sort of final reform of previous legislation. And I want just to say about that we had this passage from a directive. So before we had a directive on medical device, and now we have a regulation. From a legal point of view, this is quite important, because when you have a regulation in the European Union, directive, you need other member states to implement the directive in their territories. Instead, when we have a regulation, the regulation enters directly, and so is directly applicable. And so this is important because, you see, we have a slightly passage in an overall policy consideration, because the health sector is not a field in which the European Union has a complete and full competence. So it's really debate if it's possible to how is shared the competence in the health field between Union and the member states. And we can say that this idea, when we have a regulation, there is a more strong presence of the Union in regulating than the member states. And I think that this is not the case, because the regulation was enacted before the COVID-19. But what we can see after the COVID-19 crisis and all what happens with the vaccines and all the devices connected to COVID-19, what we see is that now it's more accepted that the Union must have a more clear competence in the health issue. But coming to our framework, we can say that the regulation maintains 4 classes of product. So the idea is to have a distinction between the medical devices and the sort of classes that are defined by the risk of the device on the health of the patients. And so what happened from in the new regulation is that in a very general term, now we have more control. So the requirements and the conformity assessment procedure are more complex. So the transformation is towards a stricter control on the safety of the products. So it means that if in the past maybe it was easier to have a recognition and admission to the market to medical devices in the European Union instead of the US, because maybe in the US it takes more time. Now I think that the situation is more or less the same, because there is more controls. But what is interesting that this complexity, let's say, is due on one side from a stricter control on the process to accept in the market the product on one side, and on the other in the involvement not only of the national authorities in the process, but also in a common authority. So there is the introduction of a control at union level. This is maybe something that also Professor Field before mentioned, because they distinguish between the state, the different states in the US regulation. And this is more or less also in the union, because we have a sort of multi-level regulation, multi-level system. And but what we are seeing here in Europe is that the union is gaining position in controlling and in trying to have a more uniform system. Of course, in the European Union, when the producer completed the procedure, and then you can the market access is given by the CE certificate mark. And so this is given not by a European agency, but the national agencies. And it is but when there is devices that are really that can have risk for the health, and so they are in the most risky class. In this case, it's there is this new committee, medical device coordination group, that is composed by all the representatives of the member states. So there is not just a control at the national level, but a sort of ratification by a European body. So the protection of patients, the regulation addresses the protection of individuals concerned, and I identify here, of course, the patient and the consumer can be the same subjects, but in the case when you, in this regulation that is mainly addressed to the medical devices, so the idea is to protect the patient. And this protection, the protection of individual rights, is given by the safety regulation. So the idea is, the idea of the European Union is to create a sort of a sort of system of control in authorizing the use of medical devices that is strong in improve and in guarantee the safety of the device. And these are made by the conformity assessment procedure. And so here I don't have the time, but we have a very detailed regulation concerning the kind of evidences of clinical trials you have to do, the number of person involved or animal so involved in the research. And so it's a very regulated procedure and rules, but it was introduced also a post-market clinical follow-up. This is new because in the past it was just in the pre-authorization phase that there was the involvement of the producer, and now there is also commitments and duty for the producer also to provide the data and to control also the use and the possible effects after the marketing of the product. And then there is now a stronger market surveillance by the national authorities, as also the group that I mentioned before. As I said, the scope of application of the directive is medical devices. And so one of the problems is what is intended for medical devices. So what can we consider as medical devices? Because of course, if our sort of control of these new technologies applied to the health system is just in the market regulation, it's really important to identify what is intended for medical device. And here we can say that now the regulation provides a definition, and but also because the past legislation was applied by the Court of Justice, we can say that the trend is to have a wide interpretation for medical devices. So the idea is to consider medical devices also devices that maybe you can also have some doubts if they are or not medical devices. So an extensive interpretation. For example, one of the problems that it was also in the case law is the use of software, because the software is really important in this kind of devices. And so in the past, and maybe the software is not really connected to the device, is external. So we can have many legal problems in the interpretation of what is a medical device, because of course, if we not consider this software, for example, as a medical device, so the marketing is free, and so there is no the control on the effect on the risk of the patient, and so we can say that the regulation provided a quite wide definition, and it's possible also by the way of interpretation to enlarge this definition, so to try to cover the most possible devices in this regulation. Of course, as I said before, one of the big problem now is what happens when we have devices that are not considered as medical devices because maybe they are not used in a medical context, and at the same they can have effect, and they can put at risk the health. And in the case of the neurotechnologies, of course, before it was quite clear how the distinction between, I understand the distinction now between invasive and non-invasive devices. But what happens when we are outside of the medical environment? So when we use for recreational, or for example, just to, I don't know, maybe it's easier to understand for us when some techniques are used for aesthetic and not for medical, but we know that maybe this the same devices, even if not used in a medical or for a medical purpose, they can have a risk. And this is, I think, this risk can be higher in neurotechnologies. And so the regulation, so this was one of the problems of the past regulation. To introduce a different regulation for non-medical device, or to extend the medical device regulation to non-medical devices. And this was the choice of the European legislator. And so now we have these devices that, even if they are not used and produced for a medical purpose, but if they present an high risk profile for the health and for the consumer, they are under the regulation, and so they are compared to medical devices. Of course, here it means that when you use this technique, you need to have a market surveillance. So you have to control the market and to check all the devices that are sold in the market, and to understand when you are in a situation. Because of course, if you are in the medical situation, it's easier when there is a producer. They start the process and they say this is for medical use. I'm sure that this is the process. But when you are outside, and so here you need is where you need the market surveillance. Of course, here then we have all the problem of also dual use devices. So the other issue can be when I have a medical devices that are used not in a medical purpose. And here, of course, we have all the problem of human rights. And the cases can be, for example, the case of the use of these devices to control, maybe to brain control for prisoner, to have to collect data without the consent of the person for use that are not medical, not to help people, but maybe to in the war or in particular situation. Of course, this is the dual use trade is something that is well known in international trade. But again, this is also a trade problem. So the concern is not just the dual use within your market, within the union, that maybe you can try to, you can address with market surveillance, but the problem is also for the export and import of dual use, because you don't know exactly. Of course, maybe in the union you have a regulation, and you can be sure, or at least you can have a good. You can think that there is a good use of the device, but maybe if the same market regulation the market regulation is different in other countries, so you have to take into account also the negative use and the risk of this in the export and the import. And of course, here we have other questions raised. One is the union, in order to protect the market from devices coming from third countries, the union requests that all the devices, medical devices, must comply with the European rules. So also the devices imported by the US must be regulated, must be admitted with the CE mark in order to be marketed in the union. But of course, and a question is market surveillance sufficient? Also, the use, especially use of data, the data collection that you can have with this. And then finally, and I'm going to close, another question is if this kind of regulation, market regulation concerning medical devices can be the best way to provide a balance between the protection of individual patients or consumer on one side, but also the evolution of the market and the evolution of the industry. In fact, we know that we have two different interests at stake. On one side, the industry that needs legal certainty, transparency, but also to have a very fast procedure for the marketing of their product, and on the other side, the interest to have a very the safest product possible, and so to have a procedure that can guarantee the safety of and the lack of risk. And of course, the question is it possible with this kind of instruments that imply burden procedure to respect also the time of the evolution in this sector, because of course the evolution is fast, and sometimes there is if the time is too much, you cannot benefit of one technology, because you are not. It takes too much time. And so we have also the problem of the patent protection that is, but I think that I will stop here because this is another wide and big. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. We will have just a short break, 10 minutes, not more, and we'll be back soon.
So welcome back. I don't know. Welcome back. We will now, for the second part of the seminar, we will change the order that was established in the program at the beginning. And just a few words to introduce you to our next speaker, who is Professor Gianclaudio Malghieri, who is an Associate Professor of Law and Technology at the EDHEC Business School in Lille, France, where he conducts research at the Augmented Law Institute. He is also co-director of the Brussels Privacy Hub, guest professor at the Free University of Brussels, and editorial board member of Computer Law and Security Review. He conducts research and teaches data protection law, privacy, artificial intelligence regulation, digital law, consumer protection in the digital market, data sustainability, and intellectual property law. Without further delay, and excusing myself for the delay in the schedule, Professor Gianclaudio Malghieri, you have the floor. I'm going to activate your administrator mode. So you should now be able to share your slides with us. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, and we can also see you.
Yeah, thank you. Great. So I'm very happy to be virtually here. Sorry for not being there. I'm Italian. I would have loved to be there, but working in France and Belgium, it was a bit hard. I'm gonna share a presentation because today I have just one screen, so I hope it will work. Just 1 second. I will be very, very rapid because I have another commitment in a few minutes, so we were a bit late, but it's okay. So I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, I think now you see my presentation, right? I will put it big screen. Just 1 second. Okay.
Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
Yeah, great. So what I would like to address today, I mean, I appreciated a lot the presentations before, and I think there is a great fil rouge between all them because they were all about regulatory challenges of neurotechnologies. What I would like to address today now is GDPR and data protection. It was mentioned several times, but is it the GDPR adequate and equipped to address the challenges of neurotechnology? I'm going to invite you to access to this new article was published a few months ago, just 1.5 months ago, by Marcello Ienca and me on Journal of Law and the Biosciences, Mental Data Protection and the GDPR. It's open access, so you can download it easily. It was a long interdisciplinary research between neuroethics, because Marcello Ienca is a neuroethicist. I think he's one of the the few people that invented the terms neuroethics, and data protection. That was my part. So in this paper, we tried to address the issue of whether the GDPR is a good tool to protect our mental data and our mental privacy. Many things have already been said. There is a problem in terms of repurposing, because these neurotechnologies were conceived for healthcare purposes, and now they are used for consumers' self-help or marketing purposes. The huge amount and sensitivity of information is remarkable, and we have many risks. So what is mental data? Why we use this term, and why not brain data? I think 2 speakers ago there was this description of brain data. We prefer to use mental data because it's a bit a new term, and we think that mental data is something that overlaps with neural data and with non-neural data that can be taken, but also something more. So neural data are all diagnostic and biometric data about our brain, what we could say brain data in a way. Behavioral data are all other data that refers to our behaviors. These behaviors can be related to our mind, but can also be related to just habits, consumer preferences, and so on. Mental data is all kind of personal data that refers to our mind, our beliefs, our thoughts, and our brain. So it's a bit of a overlap category in which some part of neural data are and some part of behavioral data are, but they are even something more. I mean, in the examples, maybe it will be clearer, but, you know, and in the article you can find a better explanation. The definitional part was from by my co-author, that as a philosopher and ethicist was very good in this theoretical part, in all part actually. There are different variables that we should consider for analyzing the legal implications. First of all, the context. Where do we use this neurotechnology? In the commercial field, in the medical field, it's an autonomous choice, and so on. The second is the purposes. The purpose of using neurotechnologies is for diagnosis, for self-diagnosis, for quantified self, so for improving my own capabilities, or for targeting consumers. So the actor here is not the consumer herself, but it's the marketer, the seller. And the last thing that is connected to the purposes is the interests. What are the interests behind processing mental data through neurotechnologies, for example, or not through neurotechnologies, but just observing people on social media or on their, you know, digital footprint? Public interest, for example, for diagnosis, or private interest, for example, self-well-being, or external private interest. So the first question under the GDPR is if these data are actually sensitive or not. And this was a big problem. I've worked at, you know, long process about the definition of sensitive data, and it's one of the, you know, most open issues that we have in data protection law. Well, the answer is sometimes. And here I try to explain. Because in the definition of special categories of data, there are health data, and health data has a big approach. So information that can reveal health conditions of a person, health status in the present, in the past, in the future, even mental and physical. So it's okay. In that case, all information referring to our mind, in a way, might be considered health data if they, for example, reveal a state of depression or some neurological issues. But then we know that there are many more data. Also, if this data refer to sexual life, sexual orientation, or our beliefs, in a way they are sensitive data under Article 9 of the GDPR. Or if they are biometric data, so if we collect emotions or moods or mental data through biometric data identifying uniquely the individuals, for example, facial emotion recognition. Well, but this is not all. There are other mental data that are not under these categories on the left. For example, if we collect emotions of people based on behavioral data from social media or from text and data mining, it's not biometric, it's not health, it's not strictly or always related to sexual or you know, other kind of beliefs. So why should these data be considered special categories? Not under Article 9. And so the point is, can the GDPR protect our mental data even beyond sensitive data definition? Because if sensitive data, as we see, is too narrow, can we use other fields, other categories? And here it comes the infamous data protection impact assessment. That is a bit the buzzword of all GDPR implementers. I'm sure you also have known about DPIA from other fields, because of course it was one of the big revolutions of the GDPR in terms of compliance. Article 35 of the GDPR requires, in cases of high-risk data processing, a DPIA, which is a process aiming to describe the data processing steps, assess necessity and proportionality, assess risks for fundamental rights and freedoms. So not just cybersecurity risks, as someone used to say in the past and used to interpret the past, but any risk to fundamental rights and freedoms. So also risk to discrimination, risk to mental manipulation. Well, this is a good field where we could put, a good umbrella under which we could put a lot of protection. And also having a plan to mitigate these risks in advance. Well, the European Data Protection Board, and even before it was called Article 29 Working Party, they have released a list of 10 indexes to determine if a data processing is has high risk for fundamental rights. Among these 10 indexes, we notice, my co-author and I notice that many of the indexes can indeed refer to personal data protection. For example, to mental data, For example, the use of innovative technologies, all cases in which there is neurotechnology, it can be considered innovative technology. Or if the processing is based not only on special categories of data, but any kind of sensitive and intimate data. So why not mental data, data about our emotions, our beliefs? Combination of different data sets. Well, if you combine my, biometric data revealing my emotions with my behavioral activity on a social media, social network, well, that might be a case for mental data. Profiling, producing legal or similarly significant effect, or vulnerable data subjects, all these cases can clearly refer to mental data. Vulnerable data subjects also because many people whose mental data are processed might be vulnerable. I will not open the Pandora box of vulnerability because this was my PhD thesis and forthcoming book with the Oxford University Press. So I will just give you some, some teaser. If you're more curious, you can be in touch with me. But now we don't have time for that. Then beyond data protection law, what do we have? Well, for sure we have something else. We have the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive that was also one of the topics addressed today. Or, the GDPR and the new proposed regulation on AI. Well, just to mention the first and the last, because we already mentioned GDPR. Unfair Commercial Practices Directive 2005 describes all commercial practices as unfair if they are contrary to professional diligence, whatever it means, because there's no clear understanding of this apart from judicial interpretation, and if it materially distorts the economic behavior of the average consumers. Well, then there is a further layer that is aggressive commercial practices that if through undue influence, the practice is capable of impairing the average consumer's freedom of choice. Of course, this is good against manipulation. The problem is, and undue influence means power imbalance and abuse of power, as it was also mentioned before by other panelists. But there are problems because it's vague, the borderline between accepted and illicit marketing. There's no clear mentioning in the blacklist, no useful solutions at the moment, and also the definition of vulnerable people is quite vague. Just to conclude, we have also the Artificial Intelligence Act. The Artificial Intelligence Act prohibits some unbearable risk practices, for example, mental manipulation leading to psychological and physical harms, and exploitation of vulnerabilities based on age and disability. But, for example, emotion and biometric recognition is considered just a limited risk in the European Commission initial proposal of April 2021, with just some vague transparency duties. So this is not enough. Of course it's not enough, because we should prove psychological or physical harms from mental manipulation. It's not easy to prove harms. Also, what harms mean? I mean, lawyers know very well the notion of damage and the notion of effects in some similar way. Harm seems a bit of a vague concept, okay? Also, exploitation of vulnerability, just on age and disability. There are many more vulnerabilities that should be considered. Age and disability is just the easiest thing to recognize, but what about temporary vulnerabilities? So just to conclude, this is my last slide. I would like to say that the GDPR does not have a special consideration and recognition for mental data, despite the big sensitivity of data referring to our mind, that now I think you can understand that mental data is a big category in which we decided to include both emotions, mental conditions, mental state, and beliefs and thoughts, whatever referring to a cognitive states. However, even though the GDPR is not the best tool, we have other things. For example, as I said, the data protection impact assessment. The problem is its practical implementation. The DPIA is a good tool in theory. In practice, data controllers and even data protection agencies are not adequate, are not ready to really understand how to measure the impact and the likelihood on fundamental rights that are not just cybersecurity, much more than cybersecurity, mental protection, for example. And about other laws, EU Consumer Law and Proposed AI Act can help not against the reading of our mind, but against the writing of our mind, so against manipulation, but they are quite limited in this special aspect. So thank you very much. I hope, though brief, I hope to have addressed most of the point of our paper, but please refer to the paper where we have also a literature review of similar sources actually addressing mental privacy. Thank you very much. I think you are muted.
Sorry, yes. In fact, thank you so much. You missed the applause because the microphone was muted, but you were.
I saw. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if you have time for a question before leaving. If there is any specific there's time for one question, because as you already know, we are falling behind the schedule. But if there is any specific question for Professor Malghieri, he will be happy to answer a question from either from the audience here or online. You can write your question, or I can, if you write, yeah, I can see Robert is.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
One of the flaws in the GDPR that I felt existed was that you have to enforce your own rights, that there is regulation and oversight, but you have to be aware of the data, know about your rights. And if the data is on a relative, for instance, for genetics, you wouldn't even know it's there. Would be interested in your thoughts on that aspect of it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, of course, this is a very, huge and, ancient problem. The dualism between default rules and autonomy rights in data protection. The solution is not easy. I think that the GDPR tried to do a balancing between accountability duties beyond data protection rights and individual data protection rights. If the GDPR was applied in a strict way, and in a wide way, it would be easier to know our rights from the beginning. But I agree with you that putting a lot of attention on control and notice, so transparency, is very poor, is not enough. We are not interested and we are not capable of understanding what's happening to our data, and sometimes we don't even know. I think that the accountability duties in the GDPR are still quite strong. As I was mentioning, the data protection impact assessment is independent from data protection individual rights. So it's independent from the autonomous initiative of individuals. So as I was saying, I hope there will be a better implementation in the future. How can we have a better implementation of GDPR? With better enforcement. So with data protection agencies that start to give great sanctions for something that is not the basic things like cookies, consent, or something bigger, like, for example, saying to data controllers that they didn't implement data protection impact assessment for what concerns discrimination, mental manipulation, and so on. But yes, I totally agree with the point, and I think at the moment there's no solution. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Giancarlo, for your presentation, for your time. And I know you have to leave for a prior commitment, so I will just greet you and hope to be in contact for the publication that we follow this seminar and for further collaborations, hopefully.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So our next speaker, now we switch completely context because our next speaker is Christoph Googer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the surname correctly, but Christoph Googer, who has just appeared online. Hi, Christoph. He studied electrical and biomedical engineering at the University of Technology Graz in Austria and Johns Hopkins University in the USA. And he received his PhD in 1999. In 1999, he also started the company GTech, about which he will talk us about today, which now has branches in Austria, Spain, the USA, Canada, and Hong Kong. GTech produces high-quality neurotechnology and real-time brain-computer interfaces for research, medical, and consumer markets. The company is active in many international research projects about brain-computer interfacing, neuromodulation, stroke rehabilitation, assessment, and communication with patients with disorders of consciousness and high gamma mapping in epilepsy and tumor patients. So without further delay, you have the floor. Christoph, please, if you need to share, you can just share.
Thank you very much. So it seems like the introduction was longer than my talk. Can you see my PowerPoints?
We can see your slides. You should be able to, yeah, perfect. Now if you can, yeah, now it's perfect.
Okay. So I'm Christoph Googer coming from GTech. I'm actually sitting here in Austria, pretty close to you. So we have companies in different nations, and that's also the reason why we have to follow different normatives. FDA, for example, in the USA, but also Japanese guidelines and so on. So we are active at the moment in about 15 different research projects, mostly from the European Commission. And we produce brain-computer interface technology in all these projects. And I pick a few examples. In Recoverix, for example, we use brain-computer interfaces to treat stroke patients so that we get better limb movements. And after the therapy, they can just walk nicer. And in B-Magic, we work on nanoparticles, and these nanoparticles are supposed to be inserted into deep structures of the brain. And with magnetic fields, we try to activate them so that we can give a very localized electrical stimulation. And this would remove all the needles that people are moving, for example, into Parkinson patients to remove tremor. So these are very nice projects, but there are also many artistic applications done with brain-computer interfaces. And here you can see an example of Dragan Ilic, who hooked up a Cougar industrial robot to a brain-computer interface. He fixed hundreds of different colors. And during a festival, people could use the brain-computer interface to make some parts of the painting. And afterwards, he sold it for £25,000 in London as a curator. And here's another example. That's the brain-computer interface race at the Cybertron. So it's a kind of Olympic game for handicapped people. And they also have a brain-computer interface competition. And this publication shows different applications that you can do with brain-computer interfaces done by different companies. So we have research areas in education, engineering, entertainment, or medicine. And you can see that GTech is actually leading with 54 different applications that you can do with GTech components. So this is all based on brain-computer interfaces, and we have many different customers using the technology for many different fields. So we have customers in aviation, Airbus and BMW, for example, Dolby for studying acoustics, EPFL for implanting technology and for doing rehabilitation, all the way to Yale. On the other hand side, Valve, for example, is a gaming company, so they use brain-computer interfaces for computer games. And I'm showing you a few examples what we are doing. So Recoverix is a medical product that we are using to treat stroke patients. In this case, you can actually see a patient who had a stroke a few years ago. We put on the EEG headset, which is sending the EEG data to the brain-computer interface. And then we are showing an avatar in front of the patient. In this case, the avatar is lifting the left hand. And this is the instruction for the patient to imagine the left hand movement. The brain-computer interface picks it up, and then we stimulate the left hand muscle so that the hand is really moving. This is repeated 240 times in one therapy session. So we do left hand movement and right hand movement to activate both hemispheres. Patients are coming back 25 times. And we see highly significant improvements basically in everybody. And very nice is that people can have the treatment 1 year, 10 years, 20 or 30 years after the stroke, and it's still effective. And it's also independent of age. So it works for children as well as for very old people. So this is a medical product. And at the moment it's used by therapists. So we have, for example, nurses and physiotherapists in our own rehabilitation centers, and they are treating the patients. So here where I am sitting, we did already 30,000 treatments of stroke patients just in our location at GTech. And we have about 100 systems installed at the moment worldwide. And we have also a franchise system where therapists can get the technology. But that's also the problem. At the moment, the Austrian regulations allow only nurses, physiotherapists, and occupational therapists to use such neurotechnology. But actually, many more people could use such technology because after a careful training, you don't need the education as an occupational therapist, for example, to use this type of brain-computer interface. And here you can also see our declaration of conformity. So it's a medical product. It's CE certified for the European market, but we have also certifications for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, so many different countries. You can also see the harmonized standards, like the medical normative 6601 that you have to follow. And then there are many substandards. And of course, the list of standards is getting longer and longer. And important is also that we need a notified body, in our case, TÜV Süd in Germany, who is auditing the whole quality management system and also our products. The Recoverix product was under clinical study. So we did it together with TÜV Süd, with the Clinical Evaluation Center. So we have experts sitting there. They were controlling the study. And basically we found out that the treatment is highly significant and outperforming other technologies. And that's the reason why it's so successful at the moment. So medical certification is, of course, very important for that. And here's another reason why we need brain-computer interface technology. So this is coming from Dr. Kamada from Asaikawa University in Japan. And he's a neurosurgeon. In this case, he's working with an epilepsy. Surgeon is supposed to tissue to interrupt the seizure. And at the beginning, they have to do a functional testing to understand which brain regions are important for the patient. This is done with electrical current stimulation. So the patient has to do different tasks, and they are stimulating different pairs of implanted electrodes. So in this case, the patient has 64 channels implanted with platinum electrodes, and they are stimulating at the moment electrode 11 versus 17. And they are turning up the current from 1 milliamp, 2 milliamps, 4 milliamps, until they reach 10 milliamps. They are observing if the patient is feeling something. So at the moment, she was reporting that she could feel, for example, the fingertips, and then they write down, this is the finger region. This procedure normally takes 1 or 2 days. And it's also very unpleasant for the patient because basically you are sitting there with open scalp. It's also unpleasant for the neurosurgeon because you can actually induce seizures if you are injecting too much current. You can see when they stimulate electrodes 12 versus 13, then she's reporting sensation of the lips. So they were hitting now the lip sensitive region. Now you can see the technician, he's plugging in different pairs of electrodes to the electrical stimulator, and then they are doing picture naming. So in this case, the patient has to name the pictures. For that, she needs Broca's area to formulate the word. And they try to interrupt this picture naming with the electrical stimulation of the cortex. And in a few moments, you can see that they are actually inducing a seizure because they injected too much current. This is, of course, something that you want to avoid because now you can terminate the mapping procedure. The patient has to rest for a couple of days and then you have to start with the mapping again. So it's dangerous and unpleasant. And that's the reason why we developed a brain-computer interface that can avoid all these troubles. So this medical product is called Cortex U.
In this case, we have an epilepsy patient with 64 ECOG electrodes implanted. So there's basically a cable coming out of the brain, of the scalp. And then we are asking him to do different tasks. For example, to relax, just to sit there, so that we can record baseline EEG activity. And after 15 seconds, we ask him to do specific things. So in this moment, he's sticking in and out the tongue. And first of all, we find an activation of the temporal base because he's seeing the face image. This is activating the face sensitive region. A few seconds later, we find these red bubbles over the tongue region of the sensory motor cortex. Then we ask him to relax again for 15 seconds to get some baseline activity. And then he's just listening to a Japanese story. So first of all, he's seeing this loudspeaker symbol, which is activating the temporal base again. That's the shape sensitive region. And afterwards, we find an activation of the auditory cortex and Wernicke's area because he was understanding Japanese language. And he's relaxing again for a couple of seconds. And the last task is to solve Rubik's Cube. And first of all, we find again the activation of the temporal base because that's the color sensitive region and the shape sensitive region. And a few seconds later, we are able to identify the finger region because the patient is moving the fingers. And this procedure takes about 3 minutes, and we have already identified the most important regions of the brain. So Dr. Kamada knows when he removes, for example, the brain tissue here, this would have the consequence that the patient cannot move the fingers anymore. And this is something, of course, that he wants to avoid. And this region here on the temporal base is very interesting because it's face sensitive. And a couple of years ago, they were removing these regions because they thought there's no functional meaning inside. This had the consequence that patients couldn't recognize faces anymore. Now with high gamma mapping technology, they are able to understand the functional meaning. So in this case, we are just sensing from the brain, but we can also stimulate into the brain. This can produce very nice sensations. So I show you one example where we can actually induce face illusions in the epilepsy patient. In this case, we have high resolution ECOG grids on the left and right hemisphere, on the bottom, on the temporal base. In this region here, so these two electrodes are over the face sensitive region of the brain. I start the video so that you can understand the setup. So here's a patient with the implant. And we placed just a black box in front of him. Then we stimulated this face sensitive region for a couple of seconds. At the beginning, he's saying it didn't change much. But for the first second, just for the very first second after the stimulation started, I saw an eye in the mouth. He was wondering, what is this? Then he realized that he's just looking at the black box. Then we swapped the black box with a ball. We stimulated the same region again. Now he got the face illusion on the ball because we stimulated the face sensitive region of the brain. And then we swapped the ball with Dr. Ogawa. So that's the neurosurgeon over there. We stimulated the same region again. That's now also very interesting because in this case, Dr. Ogawa's face turned into a zombie face. He looked like a different person. He got also a little bit addicted to it, so he was asking, can we do it again? So we stimulated the same region again, and we could produce the zombie illusion again. In this case, he turned into a cartoon character. And afterwards, we made some fun so that maybe some famous artists might have some brain damage, and it explains how they are actually painting. Coming to another application, so if we look at coma patients or normal people, then we can look at this diagram. So normal people have normal motor responses and normal cognitive functions, but coma patients, on the other hand side, they don't move and they don't have cognitive functions. But some patients are a little bit better, for example, in vegetative state or minimal consciousness state. But it's very difficult to figure this out. The same is the case for locked-in patients. For that reason, we developed a brain-computer interface that's called MindBeagle. This MindBeagle system allows to test coma or patients with disorders of consciousness with brain-computer interface technology if they have any command following and any awareness. And if this was tested successfully, we can even go one step further and we can ask them yes and no questions. And here's an example from Italy, where the therapist is asking, am I speaking in Italian? And she was actually speaking in Italian language. So the expected answer from the brain-computer interface is yes. Start the video. So now the therapist was asking the question in Italian language, am I speaking in Italian? Now the coma patient can say yes and no with the brain-computer interface. Actually, she has to count little vibrations on the left hand to say yes. This is producing an evoked potential that we can analyze. And if she wants to say no, then she's counting little vibrations on the right hand. It takes about 30 seconds, and then the brain-computer interface can make a decision if the patient wants to say yes and no. If the system is not completely sure, then the little loop here in the middle of the screen stays in the middle. It doesn't move. This is the magic moment. So it confirmed the question, and you can assume if you ask, for example, 10 questions and most of them are correctly answered, then we get a very objective proof that the patient has awareness. And this triggers, of course, also many ethical questions. For example, are we allowed to make end-of-life decisions with brain-computer interfaces? As it is a medical product, of course, we don't allow that because otherwise we wouldn't get the medical allowance for selling it. But there are also other important implications. So these systems are pretty expensive to develop. And it's also important to bring it to the market so that families and doctors can figure out if coma patients have awareness. And for that reason, it must be also with common sense how the regulations are made so that the industry is actually able to bring all this technology to the market. And I have a few summary slides. So medical devices are highly regulated. This is even more strict than aviation. So airplanes have less or lower regulations than medical products, which also makes sense because patients are already ill. And you don't want to risk their life because the technology is not designed well. And the clinical studies are done, of course, with ethical approval and clinical evaluation centers. So these are expert institutions from notified bodies. These people are not doing anything else. So they know exactly what you have to test to bring a medical product to the market. And you have to show also efficiency. So it has to be proven that the medical product is effective, and otherwise you don't get the certificate. And this is very useful. And the audit of the quality management system and all these clinical evaluation studies is also done by the notified body. And this is done for every state. So we have to do it for the US with FDA, we have to do it in Europe with the notified body, we have to do it in Australia, in Japan, and so on. So it's highly regulated. And we have to follow all of them. So the work is even getting more and more with every single year because regulations get never smaller. And this is different to consumer electronics. So it's much easier to design it with much less regulations. Some companies even skip all the regulations and they sell only prototyping boards without any electromagnetic conformity testing or any safety testing. And it's still used for brain stimulation, for example, or brain sensing. And this leads to even more demands on medical products, but they are already very much regulated. And if you look at the accidents that are happening with medical products, then it's very, very seldom. So these unregulated consumer electronic devices are putting even more burden on medical products, but they're already very much regulated and they are already very safe and effective. And we have many competitors that skip all the norms, and the customers are just not aware of the difference between medically approved equipment and prototyping equipment that you can also use for all different types of applications. And people also have to remind that prototyping development costs of medical products is about 1% of the total cost. So very often people think when they have a prototype working, they are ready. But when you're doing medical products, then you have only done 1% of all what you have to do. And with this, I would actually end my presentation. Thank you very much. Hello.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christopher, for this really interesting presentation. I think it has raised a lot of questions by the faces I can see here, and concerns as well as to the problems that you have presented. Our next speaker, and then we will have some time for the discussion, for the debate, and for any questions that the audience may have, is our final speaker, Matteo Cantarelli, who is the founder and the CTO of Metacell, a neuroscience software company. Matteo is an engineer and an entrepreneur. In 2011, he co-founded Open Worm Foundation, in which he has served as a financial director. In 2012, Matteo worked with the Department of Neuroscience, Physiology and Pharmacology at the University College of London, building resources to develop and share computational models of neurons. Matteo has also published with the Royal Society of London, and he owns a patent for an interactive visual device, or he will maybe tell us more about this. And his work has even been featured on The Economist. Matteo holds a master in systems engineering from École Normale Supérieure de Paris, as well as a master's and a bachelor degree in electronic engineering from the University of Cagliari in Italy. Matteo, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Sorry, Matteo. Okay, so. Matteo. Where's Matteo? Sorry. Sorry, Matteo. For some reason, I had switched you into participant.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We don't see you though.
Fantastic, and that's even better if you don't see me. Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. My background, yes, and thanks for the nice introduction, Marta. What I wanted to say, my background is an engineer, but I probably will not say things that you would expect from an engineer today. And there's a bit of an echo, sorry, I hear my own voice, maybe if it's possible. Thank you, because it was make a bit difficult to speak. So yes, what I will talk about today is my personal views, let's call them risks, as we're talking about neurotechnologies. I am the founders of Metacell. We build, as you said, Marta, we build software for neuroscience. We've been doing this for more than 10 years. The software we build is software that essentially mostly helps researchers to study the brain. So this can be pieces of software to look at data, to analyze data, to visualize data. It can be software to build computational models, running simulations of circuits in the brain. And it is always from a research medical perspective. As a software vendor, we are also a bit of a radar in terms of what the market needs as in this particular field. So because essentially there's people, companies that come at us and ask us to build various types of software, and I do try my best as founder to stay within what I personally consider ethical and what we should invest our energies into as a society. But definitely you find all kind of requests. Two developments related to neurotechnologies that we've been involved with so far. One dated back in 2017, whereby we developed software as part of a project sponsored by Red Bull, where 1,000 people essentially walked into theaters in the United States wearing a EEG headband, and they were watching a movie that was specifically designed for that purpose, while essentially their brain signals were captured in real time with the purpose of comparing different reactions across the population that was watching that particular movie, and essentially trying to gain some insights from this. Another example of neurotechnology application we've been working with in the past years has been again in the medical space, whereby we've been working with clinics treating a whole series of neurodegenerative disorders, and essentially having developed a system that would allow the generation of treatment plans for direct current stimulation. So that was today, earlier this morning, Salva has shown a lot of what are some very great possibilities that are offered by neurotechnologies in the medical spaces, and so that is definitely something that is very important. Okay, what I'm personally more worried about is when we're talking about consumer technologies, consumer neurotechnologies, and the worry comes from I don't know what is already happening nowadays, even if we don't yet have consumer neurotechnologies. And I'm not even sharing my slides. I could show the 3 slides that I created.
Yes. Sorry, Matteo, I wrote you not to interrupt you, but if you you can share your slides, and if you we don't see you. I don't know if you try to switch on the camera, because with WebEx sometimes there are some problems.
Okay, let me try. So do you see the slides first of all?
Slides, we can see them. Yes.
Okay, and let me.
The camera should on the bottom line. Yeah, now we can see you. Hi.
Hello. Yes, so I wanted to offer a perspective whereby the best thing to consider what are the risks of neurotechnologies is really to take maybe a bit of a historical perspective. There's been philosophy of technology that has studied in general the impact of technologies as it concerns humans and society. And the first slide that I created was a slide to try and think together what we think of as technology, and we have all sorts of different things in the slides. We have some great things like bridges, that historically were giving us the ability to go from one piece of land to another, where there was a river that would otherwise made this impossible, to mills that were transforming energy of the wind into mechanical energy. We have hydraulic plants that for instance were capable of harnessing the power of nature, in this case for the benefit some would say of mankind. But historically, if we look at philosophy of technology, all of these things, especially the latter, were, for instance, criticized a fair bit. If we think, for instance, of very influential philosophers like Martin Heidegger in 1954, with the essay, The Question of Technology. Heidegger, for instance, if we're looking at the top right picture, criticizes the way in which a technological apparatus was changing the essence of things. So in this case, changing the essence of the river that stops being considered as a river, something that you would write, for instance, some poetry about, but something that is there to be, that serves a specific function and that needs to be consumed and needs to be harnessed and needs to be stored, and therefore changing what is the true essence of that particular thing. So these are, there's a lot of literature, certainly not something that I would be the most qualified to cover, nor that 15 minutes would be enough. But historically, there is the essence of what things are has been something that certainly technology has, been questioned in terms of like what was the potential of technology to change and the perception of what things were. We have other things here that are very useful. We have an MRI scan. We have probably what has been one of the first instances of privacy problems with the evil queen looking at the magic mirror, asking who was the fairest of them all, and the magic mirror answering that the Snow White essentially was in the cottage of the seven dwarfs. So this is probably one of the first technological applications today that would be a search engine in combination with some very possible technologies that essentially, by violating the privacy, is giving information to, could be a corporation or an individual. We do have, I will go to the neurotechnology example on the far right in a second, but we have, for instance, the bottom left, a street with delivery drivers. Even delivery drivers can be considered today as part of technology. Technology has the potential, for instance, to change one of the, we will see in a second, one of the things that is important to think about is what are the relations between humans and technology. And what is called the hermeneutic relations in this case is, for instance, something whereby people are holding a smartphone, they are using an app, technology, cool, I can order my food right away just with the push of a button. And I can track in real time where my food is. And it's super exciting. It's this catchy, captivating interface. And it is hiding, though, the reality of what is happening behind that. Because you do not see the cyclist that is in traffic. They are maybe very tired because they've been doing that all day long. Maybe it's raining. Maybe they're breathing the exhaust fuels with the cars. Maybe they're underpaid. You don't see any of this. So technology is hiding, is offering an interpretation of reality that is completely hidden. All you see is, good, your kebab will be with you in a few minutes. So there is very important ways in which technology, without going anywhere near neurotechnologies, is already today having an impact in society. We see Mark Zuckerberg here very proudly, walking around people wearing an Oculus device, with the advent of what they want to advertise as the metaverse that is pushing even beyond. So it's a reality that is not the reality, is whatever technology will say reality is. And then we have, HAL from Space Odyssey. And one of the things at the end of the mission of HAL was the robot who was asked if was happy, and the answer was that it was using all the capacities to the maximum, and what more could the robot desire to do? So all of this fits within the criticism that has been coming from philosophers of technology in terms of what is the risk if we are essentially challenging what are the risks if we are challenging what the essence of things are. When we think about neurotechnologies, we have essentially all these problems, but if we're not considering the medical field, we have all of these risks that become even bigger, because essentially we have connectivity that enables to potentially read and write what somebody is thinking. So reading in real time what they may be thinking, and even deciding and setting what they will need to do. These things are a bit still science fiction, as Salvador explained this morning. We are not quite there yet. But what worries me about, if you're thinking about the consumer technologies, is the fact that we have allowed all sorts of things, all sorts of applications to be developed at present. And the problems there have been essentially, first of all, I think a confusion in terms of like what is technologies and what are products, okay? Because there's been this fake dichotomy whereby, oh, do you stop technology or do you not stop technology? Even when we're talking about neurotechnologies, oftentimes this is the conversation, and then there is, oh, but it's so useful, oh, but there can be dangers. And I think where we need to go to is, first of all, to distinguish between technology in terms of capabilities. So something, for instance, that can read the state of a brain, versus products that, using these technologies, can offer all sorts of opinionated applications. And so this is the slide I was looking for, also because I don't want to be talking too long. I think this captures what are, I think, the main questions that we need to answer. So if we allow for non-medical neurotechnologies to be developed, how do we protect the faculty of judgment of the individual? How do we protect the freedom of thought? How do we protect humanity? Think about, we got used with latest generations of the smartphones, for instance, of using an application whereby for the purpose of securing your device, you put there your fingerprint, and you're teaching the software, you're teaching Apple, in that case, to recognize your fingerprint, or whatever other software or phone vendor you're using. They all have similar interfaces, whereby you put your thumb once, twice, 3 times, and over time, okay, I know what your fingerprint looks like. But if you're talking about neurotechnologies, you may have a Neuralink of the future asking you, while wearing a headset, to think about something. Okay, I want you to think about being, at a beach, drinking a ice cold can of Coke. And okay, you're thinking about it. Okay, think about it again. Okay, thinking about it again. And 10 cycles later, you have taught a private company to know when you're thinking about that particular thing. This is still science fiction today, but we have seen how this is going to be possible in the near future. And we've seen how this is going to be possible in the near future. And that is something that then, of course, the same society that was given the freedom to collect all sorts of data, behavioral data, where we are, where we're going. It's a society that has been trying, and it is trying essentially to create an algorithmic drive of the existence. That society will not only have the problem of dealing with data, you know, something that there's been a lot of focus in recent years, but you're dealing with now these databases are not anymore in terms of you know, where people are, what their eating habits are, how much they exercise, how many steps they do per day. But now you have private corporations that know what people are thinking. If we enable consumer neurotechnologies, there's no way that this is not going to happen, in my opinion. There is no way that there will not be private companies harnessing this information. So what people are thinking right now, and you know, you taught them how your brain signals were the moment that, for instance, you were thinking about drinking something, and today, for instance, we have you know, to unlock videos or things like that, you have to watch. You're forced to watch 20 seconds of ads. Imagine in a future where we enable consumer neurotechnologies. Okay, you just need to think for 10 seconds about you know, how great this product is. Think about it for 10 seconds, and then I will let you use the service. Like, this is something that will dramatically change the essence of what it means to be a human, in a sense. We're doing to humans the same thing that Heidegger was worried that was going to happen to rivers, changing the essence. It stops being a river, it starts being something that is essentially exploited by a technological apparatus. And we would be saying that our thoughts, our thinking, our will be also turned into this kind of standing reserve, you know, something to be harnessed and to be used. So that the next question, where does the burden of proof lie? Is it for skepticals? I'll call myself a skeptical, okay? Is it for skepticals like me to convince that there is this danger, or the default should be that somebody should prove that there is no danger, that this is the only way, that without the consumer neurotechnologies, there cannot be a future for society? And I personally think that the burden should be for those groups that want to say that it is the only way. So the default, as is always very important, as it was pointed out earlier. The default should be that we are protecting the humans, and if somebody wants to say that this is not going to you know, affect the human, it's on them to prove that that is the case. And the technological risk, it is important to think about the fact that it's not more, it's not anymore just harm, because you know, that is the definition that you have in engineering. It's like, okay, did somebody get harmed using this technology? It's not going to be a quantitative way to define whether the technology is harmful or not. It is a qualitative one. How are you degrading the experience of existing if you're enabling these technologies? And going along with other questions, whose responsibility is it to prevent the negative impacts of these? And are the tools that we have developed so far sufficient to prevent these risks? My answer is I don't think so. I personally, because of what we enable to do, in today's society, we have essentially gave no questions asked the ability to private companies to establish a one-to-one relationship with each individual through interfaces under the, you know, oh, it's just an app that you install. Unlocking the same with, like, unless we do something different, exactly the same thing is going to happen. But it's not just going to be an app whose already very bad effect is going to be the fact that, you know, your kids are sitting at dinner, scrolling all time, brain dead, looking at the screen. That is already something that, nobody said anything. And it's happening at every dinner table. I don't think that we have good tools. Otherwise, even these things would not have happened. Another problem is, how do we find a global solution? Because even if, say, Europe were to do something about this, these technologies will be researched in all countries. All countries are investing a lot of money in terms of, brain research. That, of course, there is a lot of very beneficial effects from a health perspective, but we know how these funds are often at some point, just following the economics, of where there can be some profit to be made. And maybe it will not be Europe, but maybe it will be the US, maybe it will be China. It is how do we find the solution that is going to prevent this problem across the whole globe? And my final question is, how do we evolve the conversation? Because again, as I was hinting earlier, I think that things need to become a bit more precise. It cannot be, oh, neurotechnology, yes, neurotechnology more. It's not even enough to go down to the level of only medical or consumer. Although for me it would be very simple. I would say it can only be used for medical purposes. Anything that uses neurotechnologies needs to be considered a medical device. Again, that is just my opinion. I would just say no to anything that is consumer, because the risks are way higher than whatever, oh, cool, I can enhance brain activity or whatever thing companies are trying to sell. But it needs to become a conversation whereby we go one level deeper in terms of okay, what are the capabilities of the system? As somebody said earlier, it is not just a brain implant. The moment that there is an application that is connected to this, and the application is, it's just software that is connected to a server that is connected to a private company. All these things need to be categorized. I think there should be a sort of a classification and an inventory, but this also for things that are not the neurotechnologies. Even I would propose this even for every app that exists and that you can download today from the Apple Store or the Android one, where essentially consumers need to know what is it that they are installing. There needs to be more knowledge in terms of what are the side effects. For instance, if you are one thing is to play a video game that was made in the 90s, whereby the game is not moving until you perform an action. Another thing is to play a video game in the future where your eyes are tracked, and depending on what you do, you're given rewards. The risks are different. And I think that the only way that we can evolve the conversation is to have engineers, philosophers, lawmakers, all talking together, scientists, of course, and to have an enhanced conversation, because looking at things from any of these perspectives is not going to be enough. You have the problem of engineers that I talk to, and I spent my life talking to engineers that are completely unaware and uninterested about these problems. Like you go to a job interview as an engineer, they are not asking you, okay, have you thought about the ethics of the software that you built? Have you thought of how your software will be employed? There's no interest by the industry to know and to have engineers, for instance, that they have more of a conscience in terms of what gets built, and this to me is also a problem. Another problem is how the way that society has been in recent decades, driven by economy more than anything, has given privilege to technical backgrounds and humanities. Because if I had the fortune of spending 8 years living in Oxford, and there is it's one of the places where you can study humanities, and it is one of the places that there is conversations that happen every day, being very critical of these developments, but nobody cares, nobody's listening. There is no money that comes from philosophy, there's no money that comes from humanities. So all of these things have been set aside, and everything has been given importance based on the lens of whether that particular discipline is capable of, for instance, benefiting the bottom line of corporations, or how wealthy a particular country is, where should the investment go, who should we hire. So the only way, in my opinion, that we can evolve the conversation is if we rehabilitate humanities and they also become part of the conversation. I probably went way over, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matteo, for this fascinating presentation, actually, for raising some of the most, I don't know, you really have put a lot of meat on the fire, because I mean, the question of how are you degrading the experience of existence. I mean, I think the questions you presented in your last slide are the key to this debate. They really represent the summary of all of the things that should be tackled when discussing the risks and the challenges of neurotechnologies, especially, and I appreciated your distinction from the beginning when we are talking about the application of these neurotechnologies, of course, in the consumer markets. Like, we have to make very clear the distinction between the advances, the developments, and this has to be considered a completely different field, what Salvador presented us at the beginning, with the general application of these technologies for the consumer, so not for health reasons. This is, I think, something that you have insisted on, and I think it's one of the keys to approach the study and the research of this new discipline. I think there are a lot of questions, both in the audience and from other speakers. So we have really 15 minutes because we are limited, because the university closes at 7 p.m. So we have time for a couple of questions. I don't know if I would start from the people here in presence. Yes. Two questions. Yes. So Robert said. No. In the chat. Oh, sorry. No, ci sono due persone che vogliono entrare. Magari. Ah, sì. Potrebbero voler partecipare. Yes, sorry. Now I have turned everyone into a coordinator, so you can all switch on your cameras and ask questions if you have. I will start giving the floor to the people in the room. So, is there any questions, any comments on? Yes. I don't know if. Perhaps wait, sorry. A comment just to. Francesca, if you want to present yourself,
okay.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Francesca Gasperini. I'm from the Department for Computer Science of University of Milano Bicocca, and I work on digital signal, actually, and I really like to work also on signal coming from the brain. I'm not an expert, but I really enjoy to analyze data, so I also enjoy to analyze data coming from the brain. I have only really a quick comment, which is probably something that you also share with me. So today we are facing two aspects. One aspect which is fascinating, and that it's calls us to go deeper into the analysis. And from my point of view, it's a scientific point of view. So I want to improve the knowledge. I want to study more deeper what we are talking about. On the other side, there is the human being, and I'm really not able to put the threshold between what we can do and what it's probably too dangerous. So I'm really scared and fascinated and scared. So this is the point. I do not have an answer, but it's only a comment.
Thank you.
I have a comment and a question together. The comment is that I was really surprised to find this approach from the last speaker, and to find a not so express restraint in the previous one, GTech. That is, you know how this technology works. I think that what would be really game changer here would be a document, a statement coming from your kind of companies, coming from people who deeply know not only the technology, but their scope of application. This indication that comes from you, from Matteo expressly, and from the previous, from Christoph, I think not so expressly, but I understood that also Christoph was in the position to favor, to consider right, to stop within the medical field for this kind of technology. Well, this is an indication which is outstanding for me. We are trying to understand, to invent legal or ethical framework to reduce damages, because we are assuming that the spread of this technology outside the medical field will be unstoppable, is already decided, but we are still in time to control it, to avoid it, to use the brake. But something must come. I think it would be extremely important if a sign could come from you. This is the comment. And then perhaps to Christoph, I would ask if I well understood that GTech is going to keep his technology within the medical field.
I think Christoph left,
Yeah.
but if I can mention a follow-up comment.
Yes, okay, Salvador is here.
Yes, I think Christoph left, but I just wanted to follow up with this because I thought it was very interesting that Christoph mentioned the amount of regulations they had to pass for their devices, which are consumer devices, but that they were approved by sort of medical boards and certificates, and it was even harder to get approved than flight regulations and so on. So I found it interesting because I didn't know it was so hard to actually pass all these controls, and they seem to be, even though it's a consumer product, it seems to be validated by medical experts. So that's maybe an interesting sort of compromise between both worlds.
But consumers, but used for...
It's a medical product, but
it's a medical product. So the end, the purpose is still a medical purpose, a treatment purpose.
I understood some of their devices are not fully for medical purposes. Some of them were potentially for others, like enhancement of memory, stuff like that, but that they had been approved by medical experts. So their safety is approved by medical boards, even though they might be used for other purposes. My understanding, I'm not sure if that's...
I would like to follow up on these comments, and given that Robert Hill is also back with us, I would like just to ask you and all of you this question. We were discussing before with Paolo Mariani about especially this thing that Salvador has just mentioned, the fact that in Europe there is this more strict regulation, medical regulation, in which all of this neurotechnology falls into, right? So the consumer, even though it might buy the product as as a consumer, he knows it's a medical device and somehow trusts the certification given at a European level and knows there is a medical decision and a medical assessment about the security and the validity of the product. Whereas in the United States, as I have understood from your presentation, this is not happening. So it is clear, it is on the consumer, there is a hands-off approach. So it's the consumer that will decide, and the claims can only apply to the fact that the product doesn't work properly. And I'm not recovering my memory as the product promises, but that's it. I was wondering whether this European approach is misleading in some way after what we have listened to today, both from the software, from the companies, and from the neurological and neuroscience developments. This is my question. That actually sums to some.
You are correct about the United States. Really, the key is how you advertise the product. If you say it's for wellness or well-being or self-education, you can make it sound like it's health-related, but technically not make that claim. In that case, it does not have to be regulated for safety. The only real regulation would be if the advertising were false, but if you make a very general claim, like this will help with your well-being, it's hard for a regulator to claim that that's false.
I think Paola wants to add something on this.
Yeah, I would like to add that maybe this is the trend now in Europe, try to put under the umbrella of the medical devices all the devices implying neurotechnologies. Of course, we are at the beginning because the regulation is entering into force in 2021, and you know, take a while to have the approval and also to have all the mechanism in force, because in the end, as I said before, the problem is how to, because as said before, Professor Field, it's up to the producer to indicate the use of the product. And so it's possible that maybe this was the position of Christopher, so they had to, if they want to use in many different fields, it's better to have the medical device approval, because it's the most protective way to have an approval, so you can use in all the other field. Of course, you have the problem to be sure that the industry is decide to, because the technological innovation is difficult to say if we are in a new technology that is maybe not for a specific medical device, but the risk is the same. And so it's up to the industry to determine the purpose. And at the same time, it's up to the regulator and to the supervisor to detect when there is a bad behavior on the market, and maybe you want to avoid the application of most deep control on the use of your technology. I think it's difficult, and I do agree with Giancarlo when he said that we are facing something that it's difficult to regulate, because in order to regulate, we need a knowledge that the regulator usually has not, but at the same time you need to to have not only the technical knowledge or the scientific knowledge, but you need also the ethical, perspective. So I think that now this is the real big point. Thank you.
If I might add a practical aspect unique to the United States, we have a very strange health insurance system. It's hundreds of different companies. If you are approved by the Food and Drug Administration as a medical device, the patients can get reimbursement. Otherwise, the patient has to pay themselves. So that is an incentive to go through the regulation, purely the monetary aspect of it.
Yeah, I was just wondering from my perspective, the one of my presentations, so the multilateral trading system point of view, for how long will these three systems manage to stay separate? We have products that are considered in Europe medical devices, but that can circulate and be traded in the US freely, and perhaps in China, quite invasive, mentally invasive products are already on the market. In this globalized environment, for how long will be able to keep our higher standard of protection of data, or are we going towards the necessity to cooperate, to find a forum, a place, I don't know, perhaps not the word trade organization, but maybe also the international brain project, where to try to strike a balance between these so different standards that we are actually following. This was my just final consideration.
Thank you, Carla. I think the point you raise is really interesting, and it also connects with the reflections that Matteo brought into the conversation, because I think that in attempting to find a common regulation, what we will find out is that we don't share the same concept of what being human is. If we take it to the extreme, we don't share the same concept of privacy, we don't share the same concept of human rights, so it's a huge challenge. I think these kind of seminars and these efforts to understand and to guarantee this communication between engineers, neuroscientists, lawyers and philosophers that are trying to understand what the right questions are, what the questions that we need to be posing ourselves are, is the only way, at least to understand where we want to put this limit, this threshold that Francesca said that was so difficult to identify. But this is the only question to try to come near to establishing this threshold in the environment, in the scope of consumer neurotechnologies. So I had prepared a long conclusive remarks, but I think I'm gonna stop here because we're gonna be asked to leave the room shortly. So thank you all very much. It has been really, really interesting. I think we have a lot of food for the mind, hopefully private for the moment, and to think about.
Perhaps you have just to say that we want to.
Yes. Well, actually, I wanted to finish the conclusive remarks with an invitation to continue this research and to focus for the next seminar on the dual use application of this neurotechnology. So the military risks, the risk of applicating this neurotechnology in the scope of military. But I'm not sure that we can move on given all of the questions and all of the issues that have been raised here yet. So I think we can stay a little while on consumers' rights and before moving on to our next topic. Thank you all very much. It has been really, really interesting, enlightening, and I hope to keep in contact for our publication shortly.
Goodbye and thank you also on my part.
Thank you.